I'm ripping off this idea from TB Skyen's Pokemon videos, so go check those out. Rose is not what I'd call anything great, though I guess an apt descriptor is serviceable enough. Now, take a guess whether I'm talking about the episode or the character, I don't think Doctor Who really finds its creative voice as a modern show until Series 3, and Rose definitely feels like the premiere of a show that hasn't fully worked out what its identity is. That complaint is pretty broad though, since it does feel like Chris Eccleston and Billie Piper have a pretty good grasp of their characters and screen chemistry right out the gate. My prevailing thought is that if I had started the show here, I would be intrigued but in no rush to continue. It's not just the overall sense of finding its footing, the specific plot of this episode where our heroes stop an invasion of plastic Nestine also does nothing to grab me. It's a comparatively safe, simple, easy to digest opening adventure, which was probably the right call. But once you know what this show can do, and even what it can do while still ingratiating new viewers, I don't think there's much of value left in Rose. The End of the World is, first of all, a really clever title, teasing some kind of conflict with massive stakes right out the gate, only for the episode itself to end up a pretty small, kinda silly murder mystery motivated by pettiness. Unfortunately, said murder mystery isn't super compelling, and I mentally checked out of the episode several times for long stretches when watching it for this video. This story does really well to capture how overwhelming the situation would be as anyone's first TARDIS adventure, and following Rose's very grounded reaction to it and the Doctor's lack of awareness stemming from being alone so long is a great way to establish modern Who as more emotionally attuned and dramatically down-to-earth than classic Who. The tension of the Doctor being such a big question mark comes through well too. The humor juxtaposing the deadly and bonkers circumstances with an officious and casual tone is chuckle-worthy, though it's something the show has done much better before and since. This episode has a lot of strengths on paper, but in the end, there's just nothing to invest me in Cassandra's dumb scheme. I've talked about the Unquiet Dead before, when I revisited it for a video a couple years ago all about episodes I tend to dismiss as lame and bad. Back then, I basically accused it of squandering or chickening out of a potentially great premise, and I think that assessment holds true. The question of whether it's right to allow endangered aliens refuge inside of human corpses is an inspired, dark, engaging moral quandary, and the episode speaks to it just long enough to whet the appetite before stepping way back into a generic plot where evil aliens attack our lead characters. There's parts of Charles Dickens' involvement that I like, but it mostly feels like a beta test for better arcs for historical figures in later episodes. This is also noteworthy for always being the episode where I'm most uncomfortable with the overtly flirtatious Nine and Rose dynamic. I'm sorry, but I'll just never be into any version of the Doctor indulging a 19-year-old in that kind of thing. There are positives to the episode though, namely how effectively creepy it is, getting more of the Doctor's alien and pragmatic characterization, and all of the performances. The Aliens of London in World War III is a fascinating mess of a story. The idea of exploring what happens when the Doctor rips someone out of their domestic life and drops them off after some actual time has passed and their loved ones come for his neck is another one of those great statements of intent regarding this as a more modern take on the show. But then you get to the farting and the slapstick and the hammy villain performances and it just doesn't cohere. This was in the first batch of stories that they filmed for the show, and you can tell with how much the Slitheen as a concept reek of a show that hasn't fully sussed out its target audience. Series 1 and 2 both feel kind of like watching a first draft of what Doctor Who under Russell T Davies would eventually become, and this story is one of the stronger exemplars of that feeling. Dalek is really frickin' solid. For as well written as this one is though, not to mention brilliantly performed by Eccleston, I've always had reservations about the introduction of the Daleks to a modern audience, basically feeling like an epilogue to a conflict we never saw. I know that in British culture, Daleks are such a ubiquitous image that there's likely not a soul in 2005 who wasn't familiar, and we're years out from the show attempting to court an overseas audience, but as a lowly American, it feels odd that this very conclusive feeling story is bound to be so many people's first with these creatures. I don't know, I had to say something here that wasn't just the millionth praise of it's great. All that aside, the Daleks never get more imposing than right here, and Henry Van Staten is a lovably hateable slimeball. Dalek manages to be the first properly great story of modern Who, and a perfect case for the Daleks as a compelling well of drama and scare. The Long Game is a story that's so unmemorable that I sometimes struggle to remember what the title is within moments of having seen it. It truly is a shame that such a famous face like Simon Pegg is stuck in such a of an episode, though he's clearly having fun hamming it up. It feels like not a lot happens in this story. There's not much in the way of strong or memorable dialogue. All the concepts are just on the cusp of compelling without crossing over, and it's just kind of a drag, in which 10 minutes feels more like 30. Adam is an interesting character in theory, if not in practice, and I think it's a missed opportunity that we've never tried to explore that archetype again in nearly 20 years. Someone who fails the companion test, not due to malice, but because of tunnel vision and duplicity and just being kind of a weenie. I'd love to see another instance of the Doctor giving someone a chance to travel only for them to just be the wrong kind of person. I like Kathika's arc, and the episode peaks in its final moments, but there's just not much for me here as a total package. Father's Day is the kind of episode I wish we got more of, in the sense that it is above anything else a mood piece. It doesn't rush through any of its story, it just sets this feeling of discomfort and then has our characters sit in it for basically the whole runtime. It's another case of the show clearly not having worked out its internal mechanics, since it just fragrantly disregards any past or future sense of what a time paradox looks like in Doctor Who. Honestly, I wish more stories did that as well, because the Reapers are really fun, really imposing creatures, and I'd love to get more wacky, scary concepts like that, which only occur when you say hang the code and do something unprecedented. I also want to ask Paul Cornell if he's ever seen The Langoliers. This one is great, just very different. The Empty Child in The Doctor Dances is really clever, and while Stephen Moffat will eventually make attempts at cleverness into a detriment, especially in his own era, what I mainly mean is that the story is cleverly constructed. It's a bunch of little interconnected mysteries serving as breadcrumbs for one big mystery, and each new reveal compounds the stakes and the sense of tragedy. Nancy's story is a great emotional core, and Jack Harkness makes a really engaging first impression as the Doctor's slick and morally questionable foil. If I had to lob one minor complaint at it, it doesn't feel like Moffat is super interested in Rose as a character across either of his stories featuring her, and so here she's mainly just a lens through which the viewer experiences Jack, and at worst an object for the two boys to compete over. It's a small trepidation with an otherwise great story. Boomtown is another one of those that I think tends to go unremarked upon and forgotten by myself, if not the fandom at large, but on a rewatch it's a mostly compelling little episode. And the thing that really sells it is Annette Badland's performance as the Celine formerly going by Margaret Blaine. With the way this show so often structures itself, it's very rare to get villain character studies, and I wish we got them more because it mostly works here, and Badland hits the beats with aplomb. She and Eccleston have amazing chemistry and are doing some fantastic performing against each other, and the same ends up being true for Billie Piper and Noel Clarke. It feels like Mickey's place in the show's dynamic gets solidified here, and it's honestly quite sad, but also exactly what it needs to be. Despite my dislike of the Slitheen's patented fart humor, this is also the funniest episode of Series 1 by a good margin. The Empty Child two-parter was more clever in its humor, but this is the only story that gets those full-throated belly laughs. It's a shame that the game shows, which make up so much of the first half of the story, immediately date it, because beyond those, Bad Wolf and The Parting of the Ways are pretty close to perfect. The tone stays appropriately dark and tense through the whole thing, the tension ratcheting up to the reveal of the Daleks' return. We get a pretty effective death fake-out with Rose, the Daleks massacring a satellite full of people, Eccleston and Piper putting their all into the heaviest dramatic scenes of the show so far, all building up to this incredible release of all that tension as the story resolves, the Doctor and Rose save each other, and the Doctor regenerates. By now, you should guess that the kiss skeeves me out, but it's such a minor quibble in a story that basically does everything right otherwise, and it's just totally captivating. As a whole, Series 1 feels like a focused exercise in working out how Doctor Who can work in the 21st century. This first year is all about modernizing the show's tropes, and in many ways that gave us a run of episodes that plays things kinda safe, and in the first half especially tended to let story quality be less of a priority than world building, tone setting, and establishing a base level of where the show could take us. Were it not for the presence of Dalek, I'd call the entire opening half of the season a wash, but thankfully it pulls itself together in the back half with hit after hit, and makes sure to end on a high note. Eccleston and Piper also do great to carry every episode no matter how questionable the script, even if the dynamic of their characters as written isn't one that I ever fully warm to. As I mentioned in the previous short, I've never really been the biggest fan of Rose's relationship with the Doctor, or her as a character at all, really, which makes revisiting the Christmas Invasion kind of a hard sell. It's a shame, because Billie Piper really is a great actress, and in theory, throwing her into an alien invasion while the Doctor is comatose is a great final proof for her as a co-lead, but I just find this thing so hard to invest in. I get that Rose is the audience surrogate, and is going through the stages of grief for Eccleston's Doctor the way the viewer is expected to, but I just find her so whiny and pathetic and unproactive throughout, and it leaves me really frustrated and unengaged. Tennant only gets to actually do anything in the final quarter of the story, and he makes a hell of an improvement impression, even though the episode seems more self-conscious than it should be, that they haven't worked out what his take on the character is yet. The final scene with Harriet Jones is iconic and really effective in a vacuum, but it loses some heat when I remember that this is only her second appearance on the show. Overall, it's just not engaging enough a story to compensate for too little Doctor. Right from the jump, New Earth really lays the schmaltz on thick in regards to the Doctor and Rose relationship. The two of them being too cutesy and flirty was already a problem for me with Eccleston, but with Tennant it's doubled, and it makes for one of my least favorite TARDIS dynamics. That said, the premise of a corrupt hospital using human experimentation for miracle cures is a fun little mystery that allows Tennant to showcase his Doctor's capacity for moral outrage, though I think allowing the hospital's experiments magical, unexplained sentience is a pretty contrived way to compound the atrocity here. Piper and Tennant playing the returning villain Cassandra in Rose and Ten's bodies is really fun. They go all in with the voice, expression, the body language, they even walk differently. Cassandra is a fun presence overall, and is allowed some real dimension as the story forces her into an empathetic character arc. This episode is a stronger one than I tend to remember, and is elevated by an especially effective final scene. Tooth and Claw is another one that's just kind of alright. In keeping with Tennant having quickly established himself as the quote-unquote action hero Doctor, this one is all adrenaline and forward motion. Basically a base under siege story with the cast being chased deeper and deeper into one building by a monster. There's really just not a ton to say about it. I like the moody, washed out aesthetic, and to this day I'm not sure what the deal is with the Kung Fu monks as a creative choice. But apart from Tennant doing his best to further establish his new take on the character and a memorably annoying running gag, there's not much here to comment on. Watching School Reunion is actually one of my earliest memories of Doctor Who. The idea of the Doctor and companions having to infiltrate a school as staff is a fun premise, and I can see why the show would revisit the same broad idea years later in The Caretaker. It's no wonder why that premise falls to the background here though, in service of the return of Elizabeth Sladen as fan-favorite companion Sarah Jane Smith. Sladen herself is endlessly charming, and this is the first episode of the show to really dig into what would become a common theme of the Doctor having to face the way his presence has had long-term impacts on the lives and feelings of the companions he never goes back to once their time together is done. That stuff is all grand, but it's undermined some by Rose and Sarah Jane's petty, catty arguing, which does a major disservice to both characters and feels very gender stereotypy. It's also fun seeing David Tennant square off against Anthony Stewart Head, however brief it is, and I like Mr. Finch as a villain who so genuinely admires the Doctor's intelligence. The girl in the fireplace was an early favorite of mine when watching through the show for the first time, which makes it kinda weird that it's now the early Moffat story which I tend to forget about most often. There's no real reason for that which has anything to do with the contents of the episode itself, because it's an incredibly strong one. Later Moffat scripts will eventually fall into this trap where they have too many clever ideas jammed into one episode for any of them to fully land. But this one juggles three really fun concepts pretty masterfully. We have the premise of a spaceship and its automation cannibalizing its crew for parts, and that same ship stalking a long-dead woman across time in order to complete the puzzle, which are fun enough, but it's the timey-wimey relationship between the Doctor and Madame de Pompadour which gives the story its heart. I'm not the first to point out that the idea of the Doctor as a sort of imaginary friend and someone who leaves deep impressions on people's lives, while years for them go by as moments for him, are themes that Moffat would tackle again and expand on all throughout his time as showrunner. But I like that this episode exists as a powerful, self-contained expression of those concepts. Rise of the Cybermen and Age of Steel is good. I like how comparatively subtle this story is about positioning Mickey as the antithesis of the Cybermen. Mickey is taken for granted by the Doctor and Rose because he's ordinary and unexceptional, but he's also all heart, and his worth as a guy who means well is inherent. If anything, Mickey is the real protagonist of the story in terms of character journey, with Rose coming in second and the Doctor a distant third. Which is really okay. I actually tend to enjoy stories that position the Doctor as a genius hero who explains and solves the plot while ultimately being pretty static, and letting his companions or even the one-offs take the real dynamic character work. A lot of the best modern Cybermen moments come from this introductory story, and I like that more than any story since, this one really hones in on part of the horror of the Cybermen being their uniformity. The sense of losing either yourself or a loved one to become one of a million like things. Not exactly an all-timer, but the Cybermen don't get this good again for a long while. The Idiot's Lantern makes me angry, which sucks because there's a lot to like in it. For one, it's nicely stylish. The mood, costumes, sets, lighting, and direction in the first two-thirds are all very noir. Unfortunately, it really loses me in the third act. For one, I don't find The Wire a very interesting antagonist, and I think a show like Doctor Who should have more thematically interesting to say, with a story where the villain is literally television. The pivot from a detective story to a more conventional race against the clock in the climax is also a real downgrade. More substantively, Specifically, Eddie Connolly is an utterly despicable, fascistic slimeball of a character, and the notion that such a person is in some way entitled to pity or affection really rubs me the wrong way. The writing, directing, and the acting for Eddie, Rita, and Tommy all do too good a job at earning my scorn for this detestable, abusive man. Having the final image of the story be looking on in approval as the child he threatened and mocked is basically saddled with his well-being makes me genuinely angry enough to dismiss the episode outright. The Impossible Planet and the Satan Pit are freaking intense, man. It's rare for this show to put theology at the center of a story, and it's impressive that this two-parter manages to be such an effective exploration of belief and superstition, while also basically being Doctor Who Does Die Hard, but with zombies. It was kind of funny rewatching this one and realizing just how much of what I remember specifically comes from Part 2. It's one of those stories that's jam-packed without feeling at all rushed, an early example of a story that feels like a big blockbuster. The Sanctuary-based crew is all well acted and very quickly endearing, and it's one of Rose's strongest showings as a character. This is something I haven't made a point to mention before now, but it's around this story that I think Murray Gold really finds the musical voice of this show. There's some all-time great tracks from this story. Hey, it's the Channel Pup episode. Love and Monsters was, for a long time, one of the most vocally hated episodes in the entire show. I actually don't think the story is quite as awful as its reputation suggests, though I certainly wouldn't say it's great either. This story introduced the now bygone tradition of the Dr. Light episode. More specifically, the narrative structure this episode takes of following a certain character on the sidelines of Earth-based events throughout the show's run is actually a decent idea which a later episode by Davies would use to much greater effect. Elton's a compelling enough protagonist for one episode, and the detour where we further humanize Jackie is appreciated. There's value in the central metaphor of Linda as a group of fans who meet over Doctor Who and let genuine interpersonal connection and artistic passion and an emotional safe space bloom from their fandom, only to be invaded by the myopic and toxic Victor Kennedy who makes fandom into work. Unfortunately, it's the over-the-top tone the episode takes with the reveal of the Absorbloff that really kills it for me. Everything in the story's final third is just too silly to maintain my emotional investment. Fear Her was for a long time one of the most vocally hated episodes in the entire show, and wait, this is sounding familiar. Yeah, having this and Love and Monsters back to back dented the reputation of Series 2 quite a bit, I think. I'll give it this, it's one of those wackadoo ideas that you're only ever seeing from Doctor Who or an anthology show. This episode isn't really complete trash, so much as it is just sort of lame, and for me a lot of that is tone and pacing. Given the subject matter is child abduction, abusive parents, feelings of isolation and estrangement, all in a very domestic and relatable small town, I'd have shot for a much more grounded and serious tone for this episode. As it is, Chloe Webber and her mom's relationship is a compelling idea that the story doesn't really wring the juice out of. Word is, this episode was a last-minute addition to the series, and I think that tracks. For one, it feels pretty rushed, with the third act emotional beats not really landing, and for two, the 10th Doctor feels weirdly out of character. It just seems like Fear Her was written by somebody who only got the broadest possible description of what this Doctor is supposed to be like. Army of Ghosts and Doomsday are a sufficiently tragic goodbye to a dynamic and companion that I never really loved. Pete, Jackie, and Mickey are all great throughout, the Torchwood stuff is cool, and a satisfying payoff to that mystery. Yvonne Hartman is also an interesting character, with Tracy Ann Oberman finding the nuance in a cartoonishly jingoistic character. Anyone will tell you the biggest appeal of this story is seeing a massive Dalek Cybermen conflict, and you can feel Davies' enthusiasm for getting to do it through the whole thing. Many, myself included, have given Russell flack for how he handles story arcs in the past, but I think this two-parter does a great job at paying off ideas and plot points from all throughout the 2 seasons up to this point. It all feels properly grand, but by limiting the main action to a single office building, it avoids feeling too big for its britches. Overall, a pretty killer finale. Taken all together, Series 2 is best described as uneven. A funny following Series 1, which separates very evenly into great stories and mediocre ones, Series 2 is mostly good to great stories, held back by a couple unremarkable okay outings and a couple outright duds. Beyond episode quality, though, a recurring issue of Series 2 is being too cutesy for my tastes. The dynamic between the 10th Doctor and Rose is just so incredibly saccharine. No matter how much I come around on Rose as a character with years passing, to have her and the Doctor dating in all but name never comes off as natural or suited to the Doctor's character, and it's basically the default state of their relationship. It's weird, I don't like it, and it's a big deal here because it will be at least another 6 seasons before another Doctor-companion relationship dictates the emotional trajectory of the show as deeply and overtly as this one has. However, I do want to stress that as a run of TV episodes, this is still pretty solid, and it was a joy to revisit for the most part. Hey guys, I hope you're enjoying yourselves. Just wanted to say thanks a bunch, and subscribe if you like my work here. There's some older Doctor Who videos and upcoming stuff which you should absolutely check out. Anyway, back to the gig. I remember so much discussion in my early days of Doctor Who fandom about how Donna Noble left a bad first impression before she grew into a fan favorite, and every time I revisit The Runaway Bride, I disagree even as I totally get why that might be. She is definitely much more abrasive in the opening act of this story than she is anywhere else, but when the action finally slows down, Donna proves to be an incredibly empathetic character, and Catherine Tate and David Tennant have such immediate chemistry that it's crazy to think of her ever just being a one-episode appearance. Ironically, I'm most engaged with the story in its first half, when Donna is at her most off-putting and the adventure is all very zany, very terrestrial buddy adventure. There's just something about being stuck navigating the streets of London with a total stranger which suits the 10th Doctor, and I feel like this story is where 10 fully and finally solidifies as a character going into Series 3. Despite being a really cool villain design, the appearance of the Rachnos is when the story starts to lose me a bit. Smith & Jones is a really underappreciated series opener. Not only is it an effective jumping-on point for the show, with Martha Jones serving as an interesting surrogate through which new viewers can become enchanted with the Doctor and his adventures, it also, to my mind, feels like the story where modern Doctor Who really becomes itself, finally. Not to disparage Series 1 and 2, but in retrospect, parts of those seasons reek of growing pains. By this story, Tennant has settled into his take on the role, the visuals have gotten a bit cleaner, Murray Gold's musical voice for the show has solidified, the show feels freer and looser without one foot in the Powell estate at any given time. It just feels more like the Doctor Who that we'll be getting going forward than it did beforehand. Space cops pulling a building full of people away from the Earth to hunt down a prisoner in disguise is also such a fun concept. The Doctor and Martha evading both the Jadoon and their target with the ticking clock on the oxygen in the building makes for a fun, intense little cat and mouse. Prima Agyeman makes a wonderful first impression and a really solid little primer of a story. I mentioned in my Vincent and the Doctor review that I'd love it if episodes about artistic historical figures did more to implement the style of the artist in question into the story. And when I said that, I was primarily thinking of the Shakespeare Code. This episode is all about factoring the bard's nature as a wordsmith into the plot, and thematically is all about the power of language. But beyond having witches as the villains, it does precious little with Shakespearean narrative tropes or devices, which seems like a wasted opportunity. The Carrionites themselves are entirely shallow and archetypal villains, though the fact that they derive power and magic from words is such a great concept which the Big Finish audios would absolutely make much better use of with characters like Nobody No One. Dean Lennox Kelly is charming enough as Shakespeare, but charm ends up being all there really is to the guy beyond brief mentions of him having lost his son. There's no real arc to the character, even with the climax playing like there should be one. It ends up being one of those episodes where the Doctor and companion are the whole show, but Tennant and Agyeman don't have a ton of meat to chew on either. It's just kind of a passable nothing burger. Gridlock Grid rocks. Criminally underappreciated episode. I adore the stories that build out a whole culture from its sci-fi setting and premise, and the story of the Undercity of New Earth, complacent with spending years just driving in circles, is somehow soul-crushingly tragic, incredibly uplifting, and comedically absurd all at the same time. Few stories capture the sheer catharsis of feeling like the Doctor's truly saved or redeemed an entire planet with the emotional punch that this one does. And that's helped by great direction, but also some all-time great tracks from Murray Gold and a diverse, endearing side cast. Gridlock is a pivotal juncture in the Doctor and Martha relationship, and some of my favorite acting from Tennant and Agyeman. Splitting the two of them up for the whole story was a great move that really forces both to assess where they stand, and sitting with the two of them as the Doctor finally opens up emotionally is up there for me as one of the great Doctor Who episode endings. I really wish this episode came up more often in discussions of this show, because to me it's an absolute classic and a highlight of the Tennant era. Daleks in Manhattan and Evolution of the Daleks have a lot going for it and a lot going against it. The accents are absolutely going to be a turnoff for people who can't appreciate the cheese like I do, though I could see how it might just clash with the mostly serious and dramatic tone of the script, combined with the infamously goofy Dalek-human hybrid makeup, and I think this is a case similar to the Torchwood episode Cyberwoman, where you've got a story that probably reads just fine on paper, but is hampered by everything in front of the camera. The Doctor willingly helping the Daleks with human experimentation also feels very iffy, borderline out of character, but you can spin it, kinda. I'll tell you what though, for as unbelievably hokey as the accents are, the performances and characterizations are otherwise pretty endearing. I like Tallulah. I think Solomon and Diagoras are interesting human proxies for the Doctor and Daleks, and if absolutely nothing else, the story is carried by the way that Tennant plays the Doctor's utter hatred for the Daleks. Not gonna die on a hill defending this one, but it's far from the worst. The Lazarus Experiment is an interesting premise that I think gets a little squandered by pivoting way too quickly into monster movie schlock. There's a lot of Cronenberg's The Fly in this story, and I'd love a somewhat more meditative and dialogue-driven episode where the Doctor confronts the first semi-successful human attempt at achieving immortality, only for the process to go wrong in a way more gradual and subtle. You can still get to a big monstrous threat by the end, but it just feels rushed here. The pseudoscience behind it ringing too far-fetched even for this show doesn't help matters, even if part of me does love how truly grotesque and singular the monster design is. For all that though, the episode is still mostly strong, particularly in its second half, where we get a great scene between the Doctor and Lazarus where Mark Gatiss and David Tennant just get to act off one another, and Martha asserting herself and gaining full-time companion status at the end is super cathartic. Overall, I'd say this one's alright with flashes of greatness. Believe it or not, I've actually reviewed 42 twice over this channel's lifetime. I'm going to use Chris Chibnall as a negative point of comparison just a few episodes from now, so it's ironic that I think his first entry on the show is really quite strong. The key word for this story is tension. 42 minutes on the clock means the cast can't afford to waste a breath. No rising action, no downtime as we wait for the threat to arrive, just toss the characters into the fire and turn the heat up and up and up and up and up as things get worse with every passing scene. Something as simple as having characters visibly sweating and haggard from the heat really adds to the sense of running a gauntlet. I also think it manages to be compelling thematically, a story about cynicism and despair versus hope and determination that pushes the Doctor and Martha in fun ways. It's funny watching the story post Chibnall's own era as showrunner because I can see a lot of Jodie Whittaker and how the Doctor is written here. Not so much that Ten doesn't feel like himself, but enough that it's interesting. You can also see some of Chibnall's go-to narrative tropes, like not having the Doctor be the one who solves the conflict in the end. 42 is not exactly top tier, but it's one that I'm always happy to revisit. Human Nature and the Family of Blood is a real masterpiece. A premise that very easily could have been a single episode here really benefits from the breathing room allowed by a whole hour and 30 minutes. We get to really live with the life of John Smith and humanize characters like Joan and Tim, with Jessica Hynes doing some particularly powerful acting in her final on-screen moments. Tennant's performance as John Smith is so very clearly its own character while still having shades of the Doctor in him, to the point where we feel like our hero's really gone and share in Martha's frustration. Speaking of Martha, man, what a gauntlet for her. She's the real hero for most of this one, and Freema Agyeman goes so hard that I tend to think of this as Martha's definitive story. Also impressive are the villains here, especially Harry Lloyd and Rebecca Staton, who are hamming it up big time. Truly some top-tier one-off villains. The story also comes with some effective anti-war commentary. There's a grit to it that the show doesn't have that often. Leave your own thoughts on this episode in the comments, and subscribe for more reviews like this one. Blink is iconic. For a long time, it was one of the show's defining episodes within the nascent internet fandom sphere, and for reasons I won't get into, the single Doctor Who story that I've seen far and away the most times. Personally, I've never quite loved it as much as I have appreciated it. It's Moffat, so the word of the day is clever, and it's a very clever game of cat and mouse, with very memorable and unique monsters and a clever, scary use of time travel. The story exists to explore the concept of the Weeping Angels, and it performs that job near perfectly. What makes it just a great episode rather than an all-time great one is that while the emotional beats around Sally Sparrow all land, Sally herself isn't a super well-defined character. She's compelling and multifaceted enough, and Carey Mulligan has more than enough talent to convey all she needs to, so I like Sally. But despite having watched this episode so often, I still struggle to define Sally Sparrow the person, or give an impression of any life she has beyond this episode. Leave your own thoughts on this episode in the comments, and subscribe for more reviews like this one. Fine, small part of my brain that remembers watching this story in high school and refuses to let it go, I'll review Infinite Quest. This one is stymied by its format. It sees the Doctor and Martha on a series of interconnected fetch quests, landing in a new location with a new cast and conflict every couple minutes. The result of that is a bunch of broad, simple story ideas that all have to rush to an end before they even feel fully established. Every 10-ish minute chunk of the story tries to cram in a bunch of twists or character reveals or complications stacked on top of each other, and the sheer volume of stuff happening in such a small period kinda breaks my immersion. The connective tissue stops it from feeling like a series of narrative islands, but it all hinges on a villain who's not very compelling. Tennant and Agyeman give good vocal performances, and there's some cool isolated ideas here, but they're not enough of the runtime to make this feel anything other than disposable. I was torn on how to approach Utopia, since it is very much part of a single 3-part narrative, but trying to sum up my feelings toward all 3 parts in 1 minute was never gonna work. Of the 3 episodes, Utopia is easily the best, and if it were somehow more self-contained, I think it would go down as an all-time classic. The Yana persona is incredibly charming, and Derek Jacobi does a brilliant job playing not just him, but also his tragic, mad, violent master reasserting itself. The guy gets to play the master for about 5 minutes and might have the single best performance of the character in that time. Taken as a piece, Utopia is an incredibly tragic story. It starts so hopeful with the return of a fan-favorite character in Jack Harkness and the Doctor finding such kinship in Yana and admiration in his plight and his genius, only for his own mere presence to indirectly destroy that good, kind man as the very, very last remnants of the human species are tricked into an early grave. It's all pretty metal. The Sound of Drums is the Doctor Who equivalent to a great big over-the-top conspiracy thriller, with The Last of the Time Lords as its more grandiose payoff. It's much easier for me to talk about these two as a pair than it is to talk about them with Utopia as a trilogy, united by the Earthbound setting and John Simm's master, who I think makes a mixed first impression here. Honestly, I found these episodes weirdly hard to get through on this viewing. Aside from the final shark-jumping 15 minutes, I don't think they really do anything terrible, but so much of my time spent with these, I was wishing that I was watching another episode, which feels mean, but it's just all I could think about for most of it. It's a satisfying enough stopping place for Martha as a companion, I'll give it that, and an Earthbound manhunt for the Doctor isn't a concept we typically see, but I don't know, never been a fan of these, and that hasn't exactly changed. Don't ask me why, but starting with this episode there's a shift in my brain, where I consider the yearly Christmas special part of the immediately preceding series rather than the following. Which makes Series 3 the only one whose wrap-up video will take into account 2 Christmas specials. Voyage of the Damned could be a Chris Chibnall story, and I don't mean that in a good way. This one is actually something that I talk about in a bit more detail in my last yearly channel Christmas video, so go check that one out if you want a bit more of the works. As the one-episode guest companion, Kylie Minogue can be a bit too over-the-top in the performance. She and Russell Tovoy are both really hammy for much of their screen time, and it's not to the story's benefit. It's really down to Tennant to carry this one, and he does an admirable job to the point where I'd recommend it on his performance alone, but for no other reason. The fact that I don't care much for Voyage of the Damned or the climax of Last of the Time Lords means I often leave Series 3 on a bit of a down note, which is a shame because it spoils the fact that as a comprehensive run of episodes, Series 3 is really strong. You've got Voyage and Shakespeare Code, which are duds, then you've got The Last of the Time Lords, which I think is alright, and then you've got a whole 10 episodes out of 14 left, which are an absolute ball at their lowest and still some of the best stories the show's ever done at their highest. I've alluded to it before, but Series 3 is, for me, where Doctor Who really becomes itself. Matures fully into the show that it will be for the rest of its lifetime, and it begins what I consider the longest run of quality episodes on average. Martha is quietly a peak companion, and Tennant solidifies his take on the character here as one of the most iconic helmings of the role. Partners in Crime lives in my head as the least memorable series premiere the modern show has ever had, barring maybe New Earth, and that speaks less to its quality than to it just not having a notable selling point beyond the return of Donna. It's not a new companion or a new Doctor, it's not the return of any big enemies or plot threads, there's absolutely nothing to make this one an event, just a solid Earthbound mystery that's heavy on the comedy and reasserting the Doctor and Donna's best friend character chemistry. The gag of them both just missing each other all throughout the first half of the story is utter nonsense and I love it. Series 4's plot arc of the missing planets is one of my favorite in the show, and Partners in Crime sets a nice precedent by making it pivotal but unobtrusive background for the plot of the episode. Matron Cophelia is a fun enough villain, and if nothing else, the adipose are memorably adorable. The Fires of Pompeii is another one of those most rewatched episodes in the series for me. It's one of those that balances being a fun, fantastical adventure with an emotionally sober take on a historical tragedy. With just 2 adventures under their belt before now, the Doctor and Donna are already a pretty lovable duo, but it's this story that gives us our first glimpse into the dramatic potential of Donna's character and Catherine Tate's performance, and fully solidifies the pair as an all-time great TARDIS team. It's the dynamic and tension between the two of them that elevates this one for me. It would have already been more than solid, the supporting cast, the Pyroviles, Lucius Dexterus, they're all interesting enough, but imagining this one with Rose or Martha, I don't think it would be one I rate so highly. Planet of the Ood, aka the Doctor and Donna incite an actual for real slave revolt. I think this episode was made in part to address how out of character the Doctor and the show itself were in their handling of the Ood back in the Satan episodes. And boy, does it really go whole hog on the compensation. Commodified slaves, complete with a literal slave trade, heck, gas chambers, it's a really heavy topic for an episode. Yeah, it's all done with aliens, so there's a level of separation from reality, but the story is really unflinching with how gross and perverse such a practice is. It's not one of my favorite episodes, which is maybe evidenced by how even shorter than usual this video is, but if someone told me it was one of theirs, I'd totally get it. You know, I've always liked the Sontarans a lot. Their great iconic designs and their single-minded warmongering makes them extremely compelling foils to the Doctor, same as the Daleks. Even beyond all that, I think the Sontaran Stratagem and the Poisoned Sky is a really fun two-parter. It's well directed, the comedy and the emotional beats hit, especially with Donna and Wilf. I like Ross, I think Ratigan is a good mix of slimy, obnoxious, and sympathetic, and I like how much of a high-stakes action blowout it is. Thematically, I think it's a stroke of genius to have the Sontarans be the villains of a unit story, and one about how the Doctor's way of life might accidentally militarize his own companions. Conversely, the Doctor's distaste for military and guns and stuff is super overplayed in this one, and I'd like it if the story made a point that maybe he was compensating for something. Beyond that, his characterization is on point, and Tennant is great as always. This one is surprisingly hard to talk about because I think it's just fine for reasons that are difficult to articulate in such short time. Remembering that the Doctor's daughter comes right after the Sontaran episodes goes a long way to explain how over the top the anti-gun stuff was there, because that's the thematic crux of this one. This story furthers the idea of interrogating the Doctor as a soldier or his own militarizing force, but frankly I don't find it very clever in how it examines those themes. I like the handling of the Doctor and Jenny's relationship, but then I also think it's pretty rushed in places, and I'm not sure how much of it is just resting on the shoulders of Tennant's absolutely stellar performance. I also think it was a mistake to have Martha here. I get that having her lets us spend a little time with the Hath, but her character contributes so little to the story that I'd have just said goodbye to her in the last episode and let the other story elements here breathe more. The twist of the war only being a week long is real stupid, and I'm also not sure what the point of it even is beyond just being a surprise. It's such a nothing plot point. This one is just weird and messy, but in that way that approach is real solid to the point that it's all the more frustrating. For all that we do not speak of Gareth Roberts, The Unicorn and the Wasp is one I've always looked on fondly. I always like when Doctor Who does a whole genre pastiche like this, and it's a really fun, silly romp with jokes that really work for me. The Doctor having been poisoned and playing the world's highest stakes game of charades is a downright iconic bit, especially. What really anchors the story, though, is Fenella Woolgar as Agatha Christie. You can just feel how torn she is, with a mind that's sharp and gung-ho about solving this mystery, but also this cynical self-derision that crops up and tells her to stop having fun or not get too confident. It grounds an otherwise very farcical episode in a story about a woman's expanding view of the world, herself, and her art, and I think it all clicks. The Doctor and Donna are on their A-game here. You can tell this is one of those adventures where they're both just having a great time. Ironically, the things that most hold the episode back are both parts of its title. The culprit being a big alien wasp feels kinda arbitrary, and I don't think the inclusion of the unicorn jewel thief is given enough space to add anything to the episode besides a red herring. Silence in the Library and Forest of the Dead are a masterpiece, period, end of. Most standout to me on this viewing was the visual direction, really immersing you in the sets and providing a haunting, creepy atmosphere, even in the idyllic domestic Cal world scenes. Being a two-parter, Stephen Moffat is able to do service to a lot of great sci-fi ideas. The Vashta Nerada, the Data Ghosts, the inner workings of the library, the very idea of River's Song, it's all just absolutely brilliant. On top of that, this story contains absolutely spectacular performances, not just from Tennant Tate and Alex Kingston, but also from everyone only appearing in this pair of episodes, as well as some all-time best work from Murray Gold. 15 years later, I think there's a strong argument that this pair of episodes remain Stephen Moffat's magnum opus. Midnight is an all-timer for a nearly endless number of reasons, but chief among them is its study of human nature, specifically relative to the way Doctor Who typically works. In a show where we tend to make one-off human characters endearing or sympathetic or heroic after a fashion, Midnight shows us what occurs when a Doctor Who story happens to the wrong type of person. To say that this episode showcases the worst or most cynical of humanity feels like oversimplifying, because it really creates an entire cast of mundane, totally average people whose vanity, cowardice, insecurity, paranoia, and self-importance arise in a very believable way from these very horrifying circumstances. As a companion light story, this one really showcases the Doctor's flaws as well, and how an ego like the 10th Doctor's can especially be a serious hindrance with no human partner to ground him and compensate for his eccentricities. Something I don't think that this episode gets enough credit for is Leslie Sharp, who in the third act manages to channel the voice of David Tennant, even as she's doing this slow, creepy variant of it. The Midnight entity is chilling in concept, but in execution it's Sharp opposite Tennant that really makes the episode. Turn Left is the prime showcase of Catherine Tate, and maybe the most emotionally intense episode of the entire show, to the point that I find it the hardest to rewatch. Over 45 minutes, Tate gets to run the gamut of everything that makes Donna Noble an all-time great character. Not only does she single-handedly balance the story's almost absurd level of heartrending tragedy and dread with a performance that sells all that and some killer comedic deliveries, but she also expertly communicates this Donna who turned right as a separate figure from Donna Prime. Having never met the Doctor, she's more vapid and self-interested, her lack of self-esteem running even deeper, yet her heart and conviction is all still there. On top of that, Bernard Cribbins and Jacqueline King do their share of heavy lifting as well, as does Graham Harper's direction. The world building of this what-if scenario where the Doctor dies back in Runaway Bride is majorly effective, even if it feels like the story sometimes cheats to make those scenarios work. The Stolen Earth and Journey's End is the Avengers Endgame of this entire era of Doctor Who. It's a big blockbuster crossover where we bring everybody back for an equal parts emotional and bombastic romp against the Daleks. I think this one manages to play even if you haven't kept up with Torchwood or the Sarah Jane adventures, and it nicely ties up the underlying themes of Series 4. The Daleks doing a full-scale invasion of Earth is something that the show's teased throughout its run, but finally seeing it happen here feels like a real event. Julian Bleach is the best Davros, bringing a real thespian pathos to a slimy sadist of a villain. I will say, now that we have the 2023 14th Doctor specials, I gotta admit that I like them as a concluding chapter for Donna more than I like where we leave her here. To this day, I don't care for how contrived the meta-crisis is, all in service of giving Rose a happily ever after that just feels kinda cheap. It's a really strong pair of episodes that has just enough holding it back to be noticeable, I think. Series 4 feels like a refined version of Series 3, the same way Series 3 feels like a refined version of Series 2. There's an overwhelming sense of confidence here, like now is when the show well and truly knows its hot stuff and can tell some riskier, heavier stories like it's no big deal. It goes without saying at this point, but a big thing that really elevates this run is David Tennant and Catherine Tate. It's the modern show's first all-time great Doctor-companion dynamic, and it makes even the weakest stories of the season incredibly watchable. You could give me 7 seasons of just these two in the TARDIS and I don't think I'd ever get bored. It's not flawless, nothing is. A couple of the stories here are disposable or messy, but I don't think that there's any complete duds in the whole pack. It's all within the range of spotty but fun enough TV to some of the best things I've ever seen. The Next Doctor is a great big tease of a premise. Granted, in some ways the idea of a normal human man having the Doctor's identity grafted onto him is in many ways as interesting as meeting an incarnation of himself unknown to the audience. David Morrissey's performance when he's in Doctor mode has something of a Colin Baker quality to it, which makes me wish I could see him in the role for real. When he's not in Doctor mode, Jackson Lake is sympathetic but also lays it on a bit thick acting-wise. Mercy Hartigan is a sorta lame villain, and the Cybermen don't make a great showcase here either. It's honestly weird to remember that this is the first proper Cybermen story since Series 2, but this is the start of a trend where the Cybermen as antagonists begin to feel underserved. Certainly not helped by this being a story that's heavy on delete and light on conversion. The Cyber King is also really stupid. It's a shame, cause in theory, a Cybermen story about the way human minds like Lake and Hartigan run away from emotional trauma is genius, but in execution, this is one of those more disposable ones. It's the Daniel Kaluuya episode! And the Mouse Hunt guy's here too! Planet of the Dead is an episode I've always dismissed, but on this watch I've actually enjoyed it a lot. It's most interesting when considered as the anti-Midnight, in the sense that the Doctor is once again stuck with a bus full of humans, only now it's all the right humans for a funny, sweet, and uplifting adventure instead of a dark, stressful mood piece. Lady Christina is more fun as a one-off companion than I tend to remember. I could genuinely watch her and Tennant together for a whole series, which I suppose is the point by the end. I also find Malcolm incredibly endearing. All of the plot stuff and alien shenanigans is a little thin, but honestly, sometimes this show benefits from a kind of shallow plot that makes room for more character moments. This is maybe the hardest I've ever turned around on an episode for this project. I used to really dislike it, but this viewing was just delightful. So, this video's pretty long, huh? Thanks for sticking it out, and if you're enjoying yourself, please subscribe and like the video. If inexplicably you want to hear me talk about Doctor Who for even longer and don't mind some very foul language, then you can hop over to the secondary Doctor Who channel linked in the description, Doctor Who Deluge, where my friends and I managed to go on for nearly 9 hours about Season 1, the return of Russell T Davies, Ncuti Gatwa, Millie Gibson, etc. For some more in-depth, spoiler-filled thoughts about the show's most recent output, definitely give that a shot, although naturally finish this video first. Thanks. I suppose if I reviewed Infinite Quest, I gotta review Dreamland too. By the time I'm writing this, I've watched a lot of animated Doctor Who stories, all in different art styles and done by different animation teams. Dreamland is the only one in 3D, and the only one that looks just unsanctionably horrid. I mean, you're looking at it, This one was also released as a series of shorts rather than a single 45-minute piece, which I guess explains why it's paced so strangely. There's potential in the premise here, dropping the Doctor in a 50s Midwest pulp sci-fi complete with little bug-eyed greys as the aliens. And some of that potential is realized, having the Cold War and Red Scare as a backdrop, all while an alien conflict parallels America and Russia in the foreground, complete with WMDs. There's some fun dialogue and endearing sense of cheese. The setting is a novelty, though unfortunately guest companions Jimmy and Cassie are pretty thinly sketched. It all evens out to an alright but disposable adventure if you can get past how butt ugly it is. The Waters of Mars is like top 3 for me as far as Tennant stories go. The Doctor and this crew of colonists evading the distinctly horrifying flood monsters would make for a memorably tense and spooky episode all by itself, like a water park variant of the Satan episodes, but add in the Doctor's internal conflict over not interfering with this fixed point in time, and it soars into what's effectively a climax for his character so far. Coming off the warm and fuzzy ending of The Next Doctor and the generally lighthearted, triumphant vibe of Planet of the Dead, this story is like a bucket of cold water to the face as we watch these good and innocent people picked off one by one until the Doctor just breaks and becomes the worst of himself. What a sequence once he does, though. Some of the best direction, editing, and scoring in the whole show. Between this and the next one, a large part of me thinks that this is a better capper for Tennant's time on the show, and regardless, it's a classic for the ages. It's time for the end and the end of time, and I'm sorry, I really want to like this one, but from the opening minutes onward, I just find this story so full of stupid plot nonsense and off-putting melodrama, and I just can't get into it. It's another big blockbuster, but it's just chock full of so many dumb, time-consuming little things that don't contribute much to my enjoyment, and even the stuff that is worth spending time on just feels overwrought. I dislike the portentous, morose approach the story takes to the Doctor's impending regeneration. It creates a really sour mood under the whole thing. Revisiting it makes me happy that RTD decided to come back to the series, because as an endpoint, this one makes me feel more bitter than anything else. It plods along full of sound and fury when frankly it could have been a single episode. The best thing I can say about it is how hard Murray Gold goes. I also always forget that President Obama is just hanging around on the sidelines of this story too. That's really weird. Overall, it's been really rewarding going back through the original RTD era of Doctor Who. From Series 1 up through Series 4, you can feel as the show becomes a bigger, sharper, more confident and singular version of itself with each passing year. Almost every episode has been better than I tend to remember it in years past. I can count the stories that I'd call less than passable throughout the entire era on one hand. This is them, by the way. There's a real sense of completeness going from Rose up to the end of time, which has less to do with plot or characters than it does a sense that Davies said all he had to say with the show at the time over the course of these 5 years. I appreciate this era so much more as a comprehensive run of stories than I did when starting this retrospective, which is really the best outcome for it. So far, this experiment has been a reminder of why this is my all-time favorite show. I'm hoping you've enjoyed listening to my thoughts so far and will continue with me into the Moffat era. Want to catch up quick without scrolling through tons of shorts? Check out my compilation with every RTD Era review in one video. The 11th Hour is always my top pick for a jumping on point to get someone into this show. It immediately sets the tone of the Steven Moffat era, pivoting from sci-fi tinged melodrama to sci-fi tinged fairy tale with the arrested development of Amy Pond making for an immediately engrossing thematic underpinning. Like Rose, this episode is built to sell audiences on a new, different version of a pre-existing show. But unlike Rose, there's no sense of trepidation or easing in. Prisoner Zero and the Atraxi make for a fun spin on an alien invasion, and the 20-minute countdown to Earth's incineration puts a lot of pressure on the Doctor to perform, and on Matt Smith to believably sell a Doctor who's working out his own kinks while also exuding confidence and focus. It's a great first step. Leave your own thoughts on this episode in the comments, and subscribe for more reviews like this one. I genuinely always forget that Steven Moffat wrote The Beast Below. There's lots of little dumb things about this one I don't care for, which is a shame because in broad strokes there's a lot to like here. This fresh, new, excited, hopeful Doctor having his first proper adventure center around a long perpetuated act of desperate human cruelty is a great idea, and Matt Smith plays the Doctor's emotional volatility really well, even if there's certain other scenes where his performance feels off compared to the previous episode. What feels even more off in this one is the production. Everything about the way this episode looks, from the sets to the camera to the lighting to the scene transitions, all feels so unlike the rest of Series 5 in this difficult to articulate way, and I wonder how much of that subtly contributes to my reticence to revisit it. I'm glad I did though, since this is one that I think benefited from this most recent rewatch. It's still a weaker Series 5 episode in my opinion, but by the third act it's an impactful, if heavy-handed showcase for Eleven and Amy as an engaging pair. Hot take, I've always loved the Skittles Daleks. They're good designs, dang it. That said, I don't tend to rate Victory of the Daleks very highly. The Daleks posing as obedient servants of humanity is actually an idea the classic series explored, but that was so long ago that I think it's a real waste to revisit that premise only to then have the other shoe drop barely a quarter of the way into the story. Seriously, it's weird how early it is in the episode that they ditch the charade, though these genetically compromised Daleks needing the Doctor's word to confirm that they are indeed Daleks is itself quite the clever twist. I wouldn't get stuck on it if not for the fact that that short stretch of the story is the most interesting part. There's a great idea there, where the English army is so desperate to win the war that they place their trust in what they only realize too late is just a different breed of fascists. On top of that, Smith spends that chunk of the story so anxious and hate-filled, and I'd have loved to see him carry that tense mood the whole episode. Smith's performance still elevates the rest of the story up to okay, as do the Bracewell scenes, which are all really sweet. Now we're talking. Time of Angels and Flesh and Stone was my first exposure to this show, and the story that made me a lifelong fan from the jump. Knowing how much the melodrama and mystique around River Song will take over the show in Series 6, I like that in Series 5 her role remains mysterious, but she's largely just another character who's along for the ride rather than the focus of adventures like these. It helps this story's amazing balancing act, managing to feel relatively standalone to the point I think it totally works even if you've never seen the library episodes or Blink. I will say that the angels work in this story's context, and I like the sadistic, vindictive attitude they're given here, but the fact that we have to start piling on new quirks and abilities and methodology and motivations to keep them interesting in just their second appearance underscores why they've never quite caught on as all-timer bad guys with consistently impressive stories post this one. All that aside, Smith, Kingston, and Gillen are all great, and it's impressive how much stressful tension Moffat manages to maintain across 2 episodes. This one's a real nail-biter. The opening titles might not reflect it, but Vampires of Venice is where we complete our TARDIS dynamic by formally bringing in Rory. Eleven and Amy were already great as a duo, but Rory's nature as the awkward hangdog straight man really brings out the whimsical enthusiasm in the other two. Surprisingly, despite his nervous demeanor, he's also got a deep, self-assured conviction that challenges the Doctor and actually brings out some of the Time Lord's underlying insecurities. It's nice that this adventure isn't too deep or complicated, so it can devote so much time to working out this dynamic. Even this early, the potential for the trio as an all-timer TARDIS team shines clear as day. It's funny, cause in a lot of ways the alien plot here is a retread of Fires of Pompeii, and serves the same purpose within the series arc, but the different structure and trappings make it feel distinct, as does the surprisingly sympathetic portrayal of the villain by the end. This is one of those that's unassuming but fun and compelling, with very little to complain about beyond some thin side characters. It is such an utter shame that we never did anything with the Dream Lord ever again. For that matter, why did we never ever bring Simon Nye back? There's a real Big Finish vibe to Amy's choice. One part TARDIS bottle episode, one part small town survival horror, both parts character relationship study with an entertainingly creepy and spiteful omnipotent villain. And Toby Jones is certainly excellent in the role, but the quiet show stealer of the episode is Karen Gillan. At its core, of course, all of Series 5 is about Amy Pond choosing the life she wants, and I love that smack in the middle of the run we have a story all about the Doctor and Rory as 2 competing paths for Amy to take, only to find that the very idea of those paths as incompatible extremes is itself an illusion. It ends up being the crux the whole series pivots on, and it's just excellent TV. Much like 42, The Hungry Earth and Cold Blood is a Chibnall story I've had quite a bit to say about over the years, as one of the reasons I was actually excited for him to be showrunner back in the day. And much like 42, it puts the Doctor in a very desperate situation, and Matt Smith carries that very Chibnall-specific mix of desperation, wisdom, confidence, and scatterbrained enthusiasm masterfully. After the last 2 episodes gave them nothing but friction, this story lays the groundwork for the Doctor and Rory as actually complementing each other really well. Their camaraderie and Rory's trust in the Doctor making his death and erasure from existence all the more tragic. By now, the modern series reintroducing classic monsters is a reliable formula, and this is the first story to make a truly effective mystery out of it. On top of all that, I adore Nazreen, and Ambrose is a particularly sympathetic and effective take on the one who screws up the peace talks archetype. This story gets a lot of flack, but I always leave it feeling very satisfied. I've got an entire video about how Vincent and the Doctor is an utter masterpiece, which should hopefully be fresh out of copyright jail by the time you watch this, so you might as well go off and watch that in place of this. It's a top 5 story of all time for me, just unassailable as an emotional character study, not just for one of history's most interesting artists, but also for the Doctor and Amy, with incredibly powerful performances and effective direction. All the while, it's also a fun, funny, scary sci-fi monster hunt. I don't know man, I went on about this thing for nearly 20 minutes and don't want to repeat myself, so I might just take the easy path and say watch the other video for deeper thoughts, and like and subscribe while you're at it. The Lodger is a really sweet and funny little episode. James Corden is utterly obnoxious in roles that bank on him to be the over-the-top comic relief, but as the grounded straight man to the Doctor's weirdness, Craig is really endearing. This is another one of those stories where the alien plot being incredibly thin is actually a strength. This is the first time we really had the Doctor be domestic for an entire episode, and the crashed, disguised spaceship luring innocent people into Craig's flat is an idea creative but simple enough to justify the Doctor just inserting himself into a normal life like this. It also allows for a clever approach to the saving the day with the power of love trope. I don't know, I just always have a good time with this one. I said in my review of the library episodes that there was an argument for that pair as Stephen Moffat's magnum opus, and I said that mainly because the Pandorica Opens and the Big Bang are major contenders to the crown. This is where we solidify a recurring theme in this era of the Doctor himself as a being who could and maybe should have the whole universe around him frightened. It's funny how despite the absolutely massive scale and stakes here, the story seems determined to offset that with a sense of containment, setting the majority of each episode in a single room or building, and drawing incredibly memorable or tense sequences out of a single Cyberman or a single Dalek, both of whom are in some way impaired. A mark of a great finale for this show is something that satisfyingly pays off a season's worth of character work while also having a well-explored plot concept, which would be equally compelling as a standalone, and I'd absolutely watch the story of the Doctor guarding this box from a universe of enemies, or being hunted through a museum by a lone Dalek while that universe collapses, even without all the very cathartic emotional thematic payoffs. This pair is just masterfully crafted. A Christmas Carol is well over a decade old, and yet has still never been topped or even challenged as far as Doctor Who specials. This is yet another one that I've got a lengthier, in-depth review on from back in the day, and every year since its release, I've made it a point to watch it on Christmas Day like clockwork. A meta-take on the Dickens staple with Michael freaking Gambon as the Scrooge proxy and the Doctor in the role of all the ghosts is a recipe for success, and this is one of those purely self-contained narratives that captures everything there is to love about this show, and especially Matt Smith as Eleven. Even as this story is rooted in a tragic romance with lives at stake on top of that, there's such a warmth and joy and brightness to it. It's the most any Doctor Who story has really captured the Christmas spirit, and I adore it unconditionally. It is astonishing how well Series 5 holds up. It's astonishing how quickly Eleven, Amy, and Rory solidify into one of the best TARDIS teams we've ever had, a trio meticulously crafted to complement each other. It's astonishing how refined the tone and vision here is, and how consistent the quality of stories is. I maintain, like I always have, that the weak links are Victory of the Daleks and The Beast Below, but even those I appreciate much more on this viewing, the latter especially. Call it nostalgia for this being my gateway into the show, but even detached from that context, this season had a consistent grin on my face, the likes of which even Series 3 and 4 never did. For being the first series of a new era, very much a different feeling show to the Russell years, there's such unbridled confidence underpinning the storytelling. Other TV shows dream of having a run of episodes this good. Hey guys, this is just a reminder that if you're enjoying the video so far, you should definitely give it a like and subscribe. It'll make me happy, and it'll keep you aware of further Doctor Who content that I make down the road. Thanks for indulging me, now on with the show. The Impossible Astronaut and Day of the Moon is some serious nostalgia for me. It's been so long since I've sat down with this pair of episodes that it mainly exists as memories hardwired into my mind's deepest recesses. Want to know how bad it is? When I think of Richard Nixon, I think Stuart Milligan's face before I do the actual Richard Nixon. Reliving this story for the first time in so many years just left a great big grin on my face. It's funny, exciting, clever, and a great first impression for the season, with promise of several engaging mysteries and unique take on an alien invasion. The silence threatens to be a touch too similar to the Weeping Angels gimmick-wise, but they are effectively horrifying in their own way. The sequence of the children's home still gives me goosebumps. Having Mark Sheppard as the guest star here is great, just a really excellent character actor. My one and only major complaint with this story is that I don't like the choice to do the whole "ooh, is Amy in love with the Doctor?" teasing. Feels very cheap and a disservice to this near-perfect TARDIS foursome. Since it aired, I've always thought of Curse of the Black Spot as just kinda whatever, and I wish I could say that had changed. Oddly enough, this episode gives me the same vibe as Fear Her, at least insofar as the Doctor feeling bizarrely, subtly, but unmistakably out of character. He's too glib and goofy, all the oblivious quirks turned way up to the point that he's more annoying than fun to watch. Like Fear Her, it's this writer's first time on the show, and you can feel how the vibe is just off. The premise here ain't bad. As an idea, it's really fun, but the plotting is all very flimsy, and not just the Doctor, but every character feels weirdly shallow, and like they're not reacting to things appropriately. The story takes a pivot into the heavy and dramatic in the third act, but I don't think it lands because the whole episode beforehand just feels so substanceless. I think what it needed to work, besides toning the Doctor down a bit, is to give Avery a real effective arc, when right now he really only has the bones of one. Unfortunately, I think this is the Moffat era's first unequivocal clunker. The Doctor's Wife is a solid episode that would be an absolute masterpiece if it had 10 to 15 more minutes. This one isn't written by Moffat, but it weirdly gives the same vibe as some of his work, where it's filled to the brim with ideas which could be their own whole stories taken separately. We've got the Doctor bamboozled into believing there are still living Time Lords, Amy and Rory trapped in a psychological horror bottle episode, and the TARDIS Matrix placed in a human body. All spectacular story ideas, but in sharing the same 45 minutes, it feels like I'm watching half of 3 top-tier episodes stacked on top of each other and fighting for attention. There's a lot of transcendently gorgeous, isolated moments here, but even as a young teen, I'd always found this episode rushed. The novelty of the TARDIS getting to express herself, Auntie and Uncle, even House himself, it's all great stuff that there's just too little of. I as a viewer never really get to feel the Doctor's hope that others of his species may still be around, because the only time the story really sits with the feeling is after the hope is already gone. It's just off. God, this one's not gonna get many likes. The Rebel Flesh and the Almost People is just kind of weird. For one, I think the 2 episodes should have their titles switched around. For 2, it actually has a lot going for it, which is let down by weak plot and good ideas that feel half-baked. Both versions of the mining crew all just seem idiotically eager to escalate the conflict, not because it suits their characters, but because the plot needs it. There's leeway for irrationality with the gangers being these psychologically mixed up new life forms and the humans being put off by sheer cognitive dissonance, but the story leaps right over that line into outright contrivance by having characters constantly say and do things that just don't scan. Monster Jennifer is effectively scary, but the journey to get her there feels rushed. Amy and Rory have interesting material that's true to the core of their characters, but even that feels a smidge forced. Most consistent strength of the story is the Doctor himself actually being really well written. Parts of his characterization here honestly remind me of Sylvester McCoy's Doctor, which is always a good thing and makes it so the story actually gets better on a rewatch. This is definitely a story that the Doctor carries. A Good Man Goes to War is maybe one of the last times that I can say Stephen Moffat completely knocks it out of the park writing for the 11th Doctor. In an era that's all about deconstructing the Doctor's place in the universe, this episode goes the hardest, and is kind of the thematic crux of Matt Smith's entire time as the character. The Smith era starts with the Doctor using his universe-wide reputation as a potent fear tactic, and this story is all about interrogating that approach. It's shown that, of course, whole armies or even religions would be built to combat a man like him, and the episode's direction does a wonderful job of bolstering that. In so many scenes, the Doctor is framed like a monster or a force of nature, not even appearing on screen for the entire opening act. Let it be said that Arthur Darvill and Karen Gillan are doing great work here, but once he does show up, Matt Smith turns this whole story into his showcase, pivoting the tone of the episode on a dime over and over again with just his expressions. The reveal of Melody as a ganger is one of the most chilling moments in this entire show, and if it weren't for the note of hope that it ends on, I'd say no other story I've talked about has ever gone to a darker emotional place. For all that the last episode felt like something the whole era was naturally building to in both plot and theme, Let's Kill Hitler feels like a first draft by someone who wasn't sure how to pivot from where A Good Man Goes to War left off. It has its moments that work, and Murray Gold is popping off, but the sudden introduction of Amy and Rory's best friend Mel's is some extremely shoddy writing, and the whole episode is just full of dumb little choices like that one. Don't even get me started on the voice interface scene, which seems designed to work against stories like The Doctor's Wife and The Almost People. The Doctor accidentally saving Adolf Hitler's life is such a killer premise to then throw away as a joke, but I don't think I'd mind it so much if the entire episode didn't feel like just an endless series of concessions packaged inside of a dumb comedy romp. Like, the dumb comedy rompy stuff is actually the best part because at least the absurd humor lands, especially Rory's one-liners, but beyond that surface entertainment value, it all just comes together into a thoroughly meh episode, which by extension makes it Moffat's weakest story so far by some margin. Night Terrors is in a lot of ways like a stronger version of Fear Her. Not a great episode necessarily, but it takes the same basic premise of the Doctor checking in on a supernatural child with a strained parental relationship who's kidnapping people in his community. This version explores the premise in a way that's more fun, I think, playing up the creep factor and getting pretty creative with a child who can literally shove every thing, person, or idea that scares him into his closet where it can't hurt him. The Doctor and Alex have a fun enough chemistry, though it does feel a little like a less novel version of his relationship with Craig. Rory and Amy investigating a spooky doll's house is fun, and a great reminder of how engaging the pair of them can be even without the Doctor. Alex eventually making things right by his son and stopping the cycle of fear is all really heartwarming. This story isn't exactly one I'd call a hidden gem or a must-watch, but it's entertaining and really sweet, with little to complain about. Leave your own thoughts on this episode in the comments, and subscribe for more reviews like this one. Let's not mince words. The Girl Who Waited is the best episode of Series 6 with a bullet. Like all the best episodes of this show, it's a killer standalone premise which gets all the stronger when taken in the wider emotional context of the series. This one is all about Amy and Rory's transcendental love for each other, and the sense that the Doctor just keeps letting them down and ruining them emotionally without meaning to. Two motifs that have recurred all throughout this run of episodes. It's reminiscent of Midnight in the way it deconstructs the Doctor's reckless lifestyle, but it takes an opposite approach by being so Amy and Rory focused and leaving it to Matt Smith to convey all of the Doctor's guilt and uncertainty and duplicity from the sidelines. It's a three-hander between just Smith, Gillen, and Darvill, although Gillen's here twice, so is it actually a four-hander? The point is, there's absolutely nothing to distract from the drama or ease the tension, and the puns just wring the feels right out of you. You've just gotta sit with this dilemma for the whole time and try to hold on to the crumbs of hope the episode gives you, even as the rug pull at the end seems inevitable. If last episode was my favorite of the season, then I'm gonna say the God Complex is a close second, and builds on a lot of the same themes. It's another great standalone premise, an alien hotel which grabs people from all over the universe and exposes them to their deepest fears as a psychic food source for a big monster, which once again wraps around to this underlying series arc of interrogating the Doctor's relationship with his friends, particularly Amy. We get some fun and memorable one-off characters here, especially Amara Karan, who gives an excellent performance as Rita. The vibe of the setting is very dreamlike, equal parts comedic and effectively spooky, and if it's not playing that angle up, then this story is all about the quiet character moments. It's what I think of as kinda like the fires of Pompeii or Gridlock, just a perfect example of a solid firing on all cylinders Doctor Who adventure that's elevated that bit further by particularly strong character work. Leave your own thoughts on this episode in the comments, and subscribe for more reviews like this one. Closing Time is fairly alright as an episode and fairly horrible as a Cyberman story. I don't know if it's obvious yet, but as we get deeper into this series, it gets harder to separate my appraisal of each episode from its place in the Doctor's emotional arc, and Closing Time's place in that arc is quite clear as the light-hearted spot of hope and reaffirmation that the Doctor needs after the last stretch of stories really dinged his self-confidence. It's clever to bring Craig back for such a story, as it leads to an interesting reversal of the Lodger, where before Craig envied the Doctor's self-assurance, here he shows unwavering faith when the Doctor feels he least deserves it, while also growing some much-needed confidence of his own. The pair's dynamic works a treat, but this story was begging to be about any enemy besides the Cybermen. I can't even make the claim that they're thematically appropriate like in The Next Doctor, they're just poorly utilized and unimpressive here. Basically non-entities outside of a rushed climax that horribly neuters them. That on its own sadly does a lot to hold this one back from being truly solid. The Wedding of River song is a whole lot of stuff. Dare I say, it might even be too much stuff. It's a big, wacky fireworks show of an episode that I won't say is necessarily bad, but it really doesn't do much for me. It all just feels very sloppy. On paper, I love the idea of a finale all about the Doctor accepting his death, while his loved ones desperately try to convince him that his life is still worth living. Just describing it like that gives the impression of something really powerful, but outside of a few token moments, the story doesn't hit like that idea should, too caught up in action and glibness and cameos, and novelty and constantly jumping around to the point that not even the performances feel like they have room to breathe. Plus, the reveal of the Doctor having been confident in a contingency plan throughout the whole thing absolutely neuters the character drama from his end, in what's really a disservice to his entire arc of this series. It's a clever plot resolution at the expense of the emotional character work, and it won't be the last time Moffat does such a thing. By a considerable margin, I think this is the weakest of the series finales so far. The Doctor, the Widow, and the Wardrobe is the third Stephen Moffat story in a row which doesn't really come together. I hate to keep throwing the same descriptor around for episodes I don't care for, but this is also yet another one which feels like a first draft. It's a very simple and straightforward plot full of contrivances and clunky ideas with awkward pacing, and it all piles up into a story that's just kind of flat and also suffering from fairly thin characters. You've got Madge and her kids who make an interesting enough first impression but don't feel fully fleshed out by the end. There's the Space Deforesters who are basically in one scene scene and just to serve as a convenient plot device. The only other characters of note are either off-screen or chunks of wood, and it would maybe be bearable if the Doctor himself got strong character work to compensate, but until what's admittedly an all-time great final scene, he spends the entire story oscillating between gag machine and exposition dumper. Also, the visual effects are bizarrely bad and cheap looking in this one. The climax up through that final scene is all very sweet and heartfelt, but I don't think it saves this from being Moffat's first real dud of a story. So back when I talked about Series 2, I said it would be a long while before another Doctor-companion relationship was emotionally influential on their run of episodes, to the degree of Ten and Rose, and when I said that, I'd forgotten just how much Series 6 is entirely about the Doctor, Amy, and Rory as a trinity. And I'll say that this revisit has mostly been kind to it. I think it's got a slightly weaker batting average than usual as far as quality of scripts, but the emotional arc of the Doctor slowly losing faith in himself because he just keeps failing in his attempts to do right by his best friends is some of the show's most effective long-form character work. Story choices made in The Wedding of River Song threaten to undermine a lot of it retroactively, but oddly enough, despite being the weaker episode, it's the Christmas special that ties the whole character journey together super neatly. As a comprehensive emotional arc, Series 6 is gangbusters. As a run of separate episodes, I think we've officially transitioned out of what I consider the show's golden age, especially regarding Moffat's own scripts. Asylum of the Daleks is Moffat's very first proper Dalek story, and coincidentally also his first story that's straight up garbage. Literally, from scene 1, it's clear to me why Steven avoided doing a Dalek story for so long, because he clearly doesn't get them. The concept of the Asylum itself feels straight up antithetical to the Dalek MO, and the Dalek zombies are a weird idea that feels more suited to the Cybermen, and on top of that, the dialogue is utterly spotty. We've reached peak Moffat trying too hard to be clever at the expense of plot and character, and it's all throughout this episode. The big Oswin twist is the epitome of this. At a glance, it's a sly, tragic twist, but in execution, it's stupid and doesn't scan. But more than anything else, I hate the Amy and Rory divorce subplot. Like, I despise it with a burning passion. Ignoring the comparatively obscure Pond life shorts, this is our first time seeing them after the incredibly heartwarming ending of the prior Christmas special, and this whole plotline neuters that ending and threatens to neuter their entire relationship. I will never understand the thought process behind the story, and combined with the lackluster portrayal of the Daleks, it leads to an episode that's quite rank. Dinosaurs on a Spaceship gets off to a shaky start before mellowing out into a good time. For a good chunk, it plays like it was plotted out by a kid on a sugar high. Matt Smith is back in the obnoxiously quippy and zany caricature mode that he was in Curse of the Black Spot, and it feels like way too much is happening at once, to the point that I felt we must have been halfway done when only 10 minutes had passed. Even in this frenzied state, Rory and his dad having a cute shared arc together while Amy has a ball filling in for the Doctor with her own pair of companions goes a long way, even as the Doctor himself is a tad grating. But then, David Bradley enters the picture as one of the most despicable one-off villains in the show, someone who really brings the bile out of the Doctor, and the episode from his introduction onward is really solid. With comparatively little screen time, Solomon really makes the skin crawl, and he goes a long way to show how an effective antagonist can really tie a bunch of disjointed elements into a pretty fun adventure. Leave your own thoughts on this episode in the comments, and subscribe for more reviews like this one. A Town Called Mercy is far and away the weakest story written for this show by Toby Whithouse. Strange for a guy who usually gives strong B+ efforts like School Reunion, Vampires of Venice, or God Complex. It's hard to pinpoint what the exact issue is here, if it can be boiled down to one thing. This feels like a story that doesn't actually have much story to it. Not a lot happens, and when the big dramatic beats do take place, they don't really feel earned. This is another episode where the Doctor feels a little too obnoxious and flighty, but unlike the last story, it doesn't feel alleviating when we pivot from that tone to one of straight drama. The latter half of this episode tries to be a big, weighty morality play, but I don't think it has much of value to really say. The Doctor and Jex have one pretty decent exchange, there's ideas in the ending that I think work thematically, if not structurally, and we threaten to do something interesting with Amy and Rory's characters at separate points, but by the end you could have easily taken them out of the piece with barely a line or plot point changed. This one has weak characters, clunky dialogue, is fairly unexciting, just an all-around bore. Series 7 has been extremely weird to Amy and Rory. The Doctor, the Widow, and the Wardrobe feels like it left the pair in a position that the show wasn't able to fully process, and The Power of Three is the only story that comes close to squaring the circle. Amy and Rory realizing that they don't have to choose between their best friend and a real adult life, while the Doctor learns to be comfortable within that life but also gives them that choice, is a great dual character arc. The Cubes pull triple duty as a creative idea for an alien invasion, a silly but thematically impactful pun, and a plotline that lets the episode focus less on plot and more on being a start-to-finish character piece about the relationship that's defined the last 2.5 seasons. There's so much narrative heft baked into this trio and their role in each other's lives that any story about that was bound to be a season highlight. And watching them all make compromises for each other as they try to synthesize their very different wants and needs is great drama and great comedy. I'm sure another writer could make an all-timer out of this premise, but even as is, this is easily the best of the season. The Angels Take Manhattan is just no fun at all. I suppose on paper I don't mind saying goodbye to Amy and Rory with what's literally a standard mid-season self-contained adventure otherwise, but couldn't that adventure have been well written? With a plot that's not built entirely on contrivances and underdeveloped living plot devices and dialogue that doesn't constantly tip over into awful melodrama? We've officially reached the point of diminishing returns on the Weeping Angels, though I don't know if it's that they're not scary anymore or if the script is just so weak that their presence can't help it. I'll admit that the scene on the rooftop with Amy and Rory is killer, really the only scene in this final outing where both characters feel properly serviced. But beyond that and Amy's final goodbye at the graveyard, this is a story where I couldn't possibly summarize all my problems with it in 60 seconds, because there's some dumb writing choice that I bump up against in literally every scene, especially the very last one. Those 2 moments I mentioned mostly worked, but as a whole, this one is a dud from start to finish. The Snowmen is only a slightly better Moffat story than the last couple. Unlike Asylum or Manhattan, this one has a good few moments where I'm actually starting to enjoy myself. If nothing else, the story is well paced, the cast all have decent chemistry, and the plot of alien snow mimics is interesting, if not maybe a bridge too goofy. But every time I start to get into it, I'm taken out by one of 2 things. One is Matt Smith, who has some great moments of vulnerability and angst here, but also a lot of scenes where he's playing it way too goofy and broad and almost feels like a caricature. Thing 2 is the sense that we are now fully ensconced in the era of Moffat scripts where surface-level cleverness supersedes substance. Be it overly quippy dialogue, constantly dropping the show's title, character choices that don't feel natural, or whole scenes that feel like Moffat just doing a writing exercise that doesn't benefit the story, it's all kind of annoying. I also dislike how heavy the Dr. Clara chemistry attempts to lean on sexual or romantic tension. It just doesn't read true and feels like the story is trying far too hard to endear me to her, so I'm sad when she dies. I fell asleep watching this one. The Bells of St. John is sure enough another Series 7 Moffat story. Another obsessed with seeming clever in plot and dialogue, another where the Doctor's silliness is more obnoxious than charming, another with a shockingly weak villain in the form of Miss Kislet, and another with a thin, forgettable plot. This one's not terrible, just completely and wholly unremarkable. The story is still a bit heavy on contrivance, but for the most part it's functional, it just doesn't have any sauce. The spoonheads are really stupid, there's no real palpable sense of threat or tension. On some level, this story feels deliberately unimpeded by anything actually interesting, so the new Doctor companion chemistry can anchor the whole thing, and it doesn't. Clara herself doesn't make a deep impression here, to the point that I have to remind myself that this is the official introduction of a character who I'll come to find incredibly interesting, and the Doctor's fixation on her is angling for cute and endearing, but ends up landing on creepy. 12 years later, the Doctor's big climactic speech is the main thing that's lived on from the Rings of Akhaten, and for as good as that bit is, the rest of the story deserves a lot more recognition. It's been a while since we've had an episode that was so totally focused on a unique alien culture. In a show so filled with action and drama, I love it when we sit down for a while and just build out a world. That and getting some extended bits of Clara away from the Doctor to see what she's like on her own is something her character needed at this stage. In a lot of ways, Rings is reminiscent of Gridlock, and it's almost as strong as that one too. It's fun that this is such a schmaltzy and sentimental story about the value of sentiment, and also a story about what makes something cosmically unique as we're still sat trying to figure out why Clara isn't. Barring the power of 3, it's been a long stretch since an episode was this strong thematically and conceptually, and on top of that, the dialogue is mostly quite good too. Mary Glell's sweet and has a neat little character arc, Murray Gold pops off, Smith is on top form for the first time in a while, it's altogether an easy highlight of Series 7. The Ice Warriors. A fun and memorable classic monster design and long overdue for a return. What a shame it had to be Gatiss. Okay, that's me being a bit mean. Cold War isn't awful, just remarkably unremarkable. Unmemorable, to the point that I forgot this episode wasn't titled Thin Ice when writing about it. It's actually hard to fill up a minute talking about it. This is a story that goes in one ear and out the other, the kind I'd completely forget exists if I didn't actively position myself as a Gatiss hater. A gator, if you will. It's a nice change of pace to have a classic enemy return not for some big Earth invasion, but for a story of a lone warrior heartbroken and scared and lashing out, even if structurally that basically just makes this one Dalek but worse. This one is contrived in some spots, but not nearly as bad about that as other stories where I've thrown that word around. There's some good moments for Clara in here as she fully feels the stakes of the conflict set in around her, but the rest is whatever. This one really is just fine. A fine little story, a harmless and slightly uplifting way to pass 40-odd minutes. Hyde is another from Neil Cross, and though it's not as strong as Rings of Akhaten, it's a pretty interesting ghost story turned interdimensional rescue mission. The editing is bizarrely wonky in spots, and the romance between Emma and Palmer is kinda half-formed, but I appreciate the spooky, melancholic atmosphere throughout the whole thing, and also that cool discussion with Clara about how everyone's a ghost to the Doctor. This is the story where Clara really cements a sense of personal loyalty to the Doctor, divorced from any other stakes, and I wish the story had centered that a bit more. I'm not really sure what I'd do to juice this story. It's a bunch of interesting elements on paper that do complement each other, but it doesn't feel as engaging or rock solid as Rings did. There's a really cool, scary, romantic, memorable, powerful story hidden somewhere in this one, but I don't think it fully comes through. We explore the TARDIS interior so rarely that Journey to the Center of the TARDIS is one of those concepts which should feel totally momentous. It's the kind of story that you want to be great, so it's all the more frustrating when it just never gets close. There's a fun idea here, of something spooking the TARDIS so bad that she herself becomes an obstacle, trapping our heroes inside and pushing them to a breaking point. Unfortunately, this story is weirdly structured, with plot points and emotional relationship beats that fall flat or don't feel earned. And that's all before it timey-wimeys itself into being completely inconsequential. If nothing else, Stephen Thompson's got a much better handle on the Doctor's character here than in Curse of the Black Spot, but I'd much rather this be a two-hander with just the Doctor and Clara. The Van Balen brothers are pretty bad as one-off characters go, all very shallow and boring personalities. The twist of the one who's been tricked into thinking he's a robot is so dumb and makes the remaining brothers irredeemably monstrous. I remember The Crimson Horror being one of the Series 7 stories I enjoyed more than most on a first watch. Unrelated, I tend to not remember it being a Gatiss episode. Yeah, I rib Gatiss a lot, but this is one of his more solid stories. It's the definition of a standard middle-of-the-road one-off, just enough of a unique plot and fun character interactions to be satisfying. The kid who's a living reference to a GPS system is a weird joke for sure, but beyond that, this is the most I've laughed at an episode this season. Mrs. Gillyflower is another one of those delectably hateable villains who really brings an episode together, like Solomon for Dinosaurs on a Spaceship. Ada is effectively sympathetic and tragic, and her plight genuinely pulls at my heartstrings in a way little else this season has. It's fun that the Doctor and Clara don't appear properly until a long ways into the episode in the form of a neat little old-timey flashback. Meanwhile, Vastra, Jenny, and Strax carry the focus. I didn't get to say this with the Snowmen, but I like the team chemistry that these guys have. It's a memorable dynamic given how few stories they actually appear in. Nightmare in Silver is a bizarre, boring wreck of an episode. Apparently that's the result of countless behind-the-scenes issues, and boy can you tell. The big problem here is just how many disparate elements in this story don't feel fleshed out or like they complement each other. The Reject Army are all underwritten, the kids, Angie and Artie, are so one-note and utterly useless to the plot that I genuinely can't conceive why they're even here. Porridge is similarly flat, just a complete waste of Warwick Davis, and boy do I dislike Mr. Clever. I can totally see the appeal of writing or playing this malicious, nefarious version of the energetic and whimsical Doctor we all know and love, but it's so fundamentally un-Cyberman that it turns this into another story that just seems to not get these guys or their appeal. It would be so much more chilling and a more effective showcase of Matt Smith's range to have this cyberplanner be stoic and cold rather than even campier than usual. After spending most of 7B on form, it leads to another performance by Matt Smith that doesn't do anything for me. I'm starting to realize the one thing that annoys me more than Moffat's constant dropping of the show's title is Moffat's constant rhyming. Good thing this story doesn't have a surplus of both or anything. The name of the Doctor feels, I don't know, obligatory? For what's technically a season finale, it feels so lacking in oomph or staying power. It's the answer to the Impossible Girl mystery, and filled with a heaping of fan service callbacks to the show's history, all hung on the skeleton of a story with little compelling in it otherwise. The idea of building an episode around the Doctor's literal grave site is one that I really bump up against. I don't think that's territory the show should ever touch, frankly, and the timey-wimey mechanics of it all and the big time scar rip thing feel very half-baked. Jenny, Vastra, Strax, even River all come back, but the actual character work being done here is all so negligible that it just reads like setting the table unnecessarily for the stories to follow. Night of the Doctor is a really effective window into the emotional state that the Time War left the Doctor in as it was happening, along with the people like Cass caught on its fringes. A runtime of less than 7 minutes forces Moffat to be very economic in his characterization and storytelling, and Paul McGann takes the opportunity to cycle through the humor, defiance, resignation, and despair like a master of the craft. With only a movie's worth of televised material, Paul managed to be one of my favorite Doctors even before watching this short, and his excitable, romantic 8th Doctor, having the light inside him, his own sense of identity and utility made forfeit by this conflict, does more to sell me on the Time War as a story device than anything we've seen or heard about it prior. Yeah, not much to say about this one that's not just narratively analyzing it, it's a really strong, small slice of storytelling. For the past decade, Day of the Doctor has lived in my head as this sort of unapproachable opus, something that can really only be consumed as the climax to the show's entire preceding history. That's despite the episode grounding most of its runtime in an adventure that likely wouldn't be viewed as anything special if it weren't a multi-Doctor joint. I say that as a compliment. Removed from expectations, the majority of this is a clever adventure, which pulls from the show's history without being pure member berries, and which plays to central themes of the series like time travel mechanics and the Doctor's relationship with the human race, without actually being bigger than the average episode in terms of scale, all in order to have the Doctor's character truly reflect on himself. The story here is laser focused on the Doctor's character, to the point that I barely mind that nobody in the episode besides Tennant, Smith, or John Hurt actually gets much character work to do. This is a story about this man, about this show, their history, their impact, their purpose, and about narratively reasserting that purpose and celebrating that history. It's great stuff. Like Day of the Doctor, Time of the Doctor is definitely better written than Moffat's last several beforehand, but it's an odd one. It's still not a story that really does much for me personally. I spent a lot of this viewing somewhat disengaged and feeling like scenes and plot points were rushed despite the longer than usual running time. That said, I acknowledge that this one does a lot of things right, makes a lot of choices that I appreciate, and at the very least feels like Moffat was awake at the wheel again. The Doctor deliberating whether to bring his home and his people back to reality at the risk of reigniting the Time War is a smooth way to epilogue the 50th special, and I like the plot of the Doctor spending several lifetimes in one place fighting off his entire rogues gallery. There's tons of callbacks and plot points tying the Smith era up in a neat bow. We get the origins of the Silence, the return of the Crack, the reuse of some old Mary Gold tracks, and thematic or visual throwbacks. For the most part, it's satisfying, or at least cute rather than grating, but there's ideas here that needed to be sat with more. In concept, it's almost perfect. In execution, it's just not super compelling. Series 7 is a shambles, an almost unbearably juiceless run of episodes. Almost. Including the Snowmen, Day, and Time of the Doctor makes this the longest string of stories I've done a video about, and I can count the number of them that really do anything for me on one hand. Not counting Day of the Doctor, whose inclusion almost feels like cheating, there's no truly transcendentally great episodes in this season, which is a first and not something oft-repeated, thank goodness. I really don't like how derisive and bitter I've sounded about Series 7, but it's just so mid. It's the first time that getting through a season of the show has ever felt like a chore. It's clear watching that Stephen Moffat took on too much for himself and may have just been off his game otherwise. The quality of his scripts have cratered, the Impossible Girl mystery isn't a fraction as compelling as his other arcs, and so it falls on the guest writers to carry the season with compelling one-offs, and excluding the occasional silver egg, they mostly just can't manage it. Also, this is easily the weakest of the show's title sequences. Deep Breath is where Doctor Who discovers one of its biggest secret weapons, namely making Jenna Coleman play the most distressed and agitated woman you've ever met. Seriously, she's great in this, but thankfully she doesn't have to carry 80% of this new Doctor's first adventure on her back like Rose in the Christmas Invasion. Just like Smith before him, Peter Capaldi projects a lot of confidence in his take, a very, very clear sense that he knows exactly how he wants to perform the character, even if the writing hasn't 100% worked out who the 12th Doctor is. I also want to shout out Peter Ferdinando as the half-face man, cause he's really strong here too. Deep Breath is solid, but what keeps it from being a really strong one is the pacing. I'm all for stories with a deliberate pace, but there's a fine line between deliberate and sluggish. Like dialogue or exposition or comedic bits are just going on for the sake of filling time, and I think Deep Breath crosses it. Into the Dalek was co-written by Stephen Moffat and Phil Ford, co-writer of Waters of Mars. And I want to know who wrote which bits, because I can almost feel the Waters of Mars DNA struggling to come out against what I'm betting is Moffat's fundamental misunderstanding of the Daleks as a concept. Giving the Doctor hope that a Dalek could become moral without immediately self-destructing is such a great idea for a story. But frankly, given that premise, this story's approach to what a moral Dalek would mean strikes me as like weirdly simplistic and childish. I also think the fantastic Voyage shrink down and adventure in a Dalek's innards part of the equation distracts from the idea rather than bolstering it. Journey Blue is a decent supporting character who doesn't feel properly serviced, and I think that's also true for Rusty himself, and Clara, come to think of it. Not gonna lie, I don't think I'd have had Clara come on this adventure. Make this a companion light one, cause her role here is iffy. This one's not terrible or anything, but it's certainly not a great sign when most of my viewing is spent picturing a more effective version of this broad idea. It's been a minute since we had a broad, goofy, standalone comedy romp, and the tone and pace of Robot of Sherwood is true to a swashbuckling Robin Hood adventure. The last couple episodes have been not subtle about the 12th Doctor having this kind of cynical, dark outlook on himself, and I like the way this episode frames that, with him projecting his lack of faith in his own heroism into skepticism about Robin Hood's existence. It all comes together with the Doctor stepping back and letting the Archer take up the hero role in the third act, and a final scene cementing the thematic heft of these two fictional icons and their shared roles as moral inspirations. I think it's all nice and sweet, and probably the strongest thematic character work Gatiss has ever done. Making it so Robin is someone who feels that same insecurity as the Doctor is really good characterization, and Tom Riley plays the pathos and the comedy really well. There's a dramatic beat for his character that I feel is missing, which is a shame, because the direct setup for it is there, and I think its presence would have really tied the episode into something super solid. As it is now, it's one of my favorites from Gatiss. Once upon a time, there was a young man who was quite cold on Listen when it first came out. That man was me, and he was an idiot, because Listen is an incredibly tight, effective bit of storytelling. Without having to tie into a larger plot thread, this story is able to thrive on ambiguity in a way that's totally singular. The Doctor dragging Clara along on a hunt for a monster that might not exist because he had a bad dream sounds like a ridiculous premise on paper, but it's because the plot is so thin that Listen can be a pure character piece in the way nothing else in the show is. There's a lot that could be said about how the dynamic between Clara, the Doctor, and Danny Pink is solidified here, the intricacies which reverberate throughout the rest of the season, to the point that I'd call Listen the centerpiece of Series 8. It's all really good theme and character work, but even more than that, this episode is made by what's happening in front of the camera. Capaldi and Coleman shine in this one. Their talent plus the direction, editing, and even the sound design all come together to create this off-putting, dreamlike study of fear. This is the kind of story that feels like we've got pre-Series 6 Moffat back. It's honestly surprising to me that we never did a heist story in this show until, well, Time Heist. This is one of the rare ones that's gone down a bit in my estimation on this viewing. It used to be a highlight of the series for me, but sitting down with it now, it was a lot of very cool ideas on paper that just felt kinda limp in execution. There's something very fun about our crew here performing a heist with zero clue as to what they're stealing or how, only learning more about the job as they get deeper into it. I love the twists and turns of the climax and the way it all came together, but it's all done a disservice by the pacing. It's edited kinda awkward and rushed, like it's straining slightly to fit itself into a normal episode length. Sai, Saber, and Karabraxos have the makings of really fun one-off characters, but their potential never feels totally realized. I see the flashes of great characters and flashes of a great standalone adventure here, but taken all together, what I got on this watch was a cool time travel puzzle unfolded in the framework of a just pretty okay story. What I'll give the caretaker is that the Clara character stuff in it works quite well. We've had some lip service and subtler moments before now painting Clara as this vaguely egomaniacal control freak, but this is the first story to really build itself around that idea and solidify those as key character traits, as she basically treats balancing the two men in her life like a manipulative game. What works much less well is the Doctor in this story. The anti-soldier thing has always been incredibly off-putting to me. It's not even that I'm against the idea of a Doctor who loathes military on principle, I think that makes loads of sense for the character. It's just that in the context of this series, and especially this episode, it feels so forced and unnatural. It doesn't feel like it's coming from a real place, like it's just here to contrive conflict between the Doctor and Danny. That honestly wouldn't be a deal breaker if the alien plot was more engaging, or if the comedic charm carried it like the prior Gareth Roberts stories. But we don't do a ton with the premise of the Doctor infiltrating school staff or the Skovox Blitzer, so it's down to the drama to make this one, and it only does an okay job. It's the accidentally anti-abortion episode. Yeah, it can't be helped, for as much as writer Peter Harness alleges that it wasn't his intent to make this story into a pro-life, pro-choice screed, the barely below-the-surface analog of the conflict here is inherent, and once the stakes are set, it overwhelms the entire episode and makes it a real rough sit. Kill the Moon is a pivotal point in the Doctor and Clara's relationship and has an all-timer of an ending, but to get to it you've got to sit through a very confused morality play with awkward pacing, stilted dialogue, and really questionable characterization. This story is all about a singular moral debate, and the script overtly, repeatedly positions one choice as the right one. Unfortunately, it makes not a lick of sense. The Doctor comes off unreasonably cruel, and the narrative has to twist itself in knots to justify its outlook. In execution, the idea of Earth's moon as an egg is something that's sadly just too far-fetched for me to buy into dramatically, which doesn't help. For being the impetus for this story in the first place, Courtney also makes shockingly little impact. Say it with me now, it's another one that feels like a first draft. Mummy on the Orient Express has always been the highlight of Series 8 for me, and I don't see that changing. It's a dang near perfect standalone premise, bolstered by the serialized aspect of the Doctor and Clara navigating this very rough spot in their relationship. It's the first time in a while that any episode has felt like such a pure encapsulation of what's great about this show, to the point that it made young me an instant advocate for the idea of Jamie Matheson as showrunner. To that end, I also think it's where the 12th Doctor as a character fully crystallizes for the first time. The concept of the Foretold is super creative, this seemingly unstoppable, unreasonable force, which our heroes can't even see as it picks people off around them. Gus is a fascinating villain, and I've always found it a shame that they never made a reappearance. This omnipresent, malevolent figure trapping the Doctor and company in these amoral science experiments is just such a great idea for a recurring bad guy. The supporting cast here are all brilliant and memorable. It's tense, spooky, funny, uplifting, and somber all at once. It's one of those absolute gems. 2 Matheson bangers in a row, let's go! Granted, I've always liked Flatline a little less than Mummy, and that hasn't changed, mainly because it feels comparatively lacking in the supporting character department. But if someone had the opposite opinion, I'd totally get it. The 2D creatures are incredibly fun and mysterious baddies who make for incredibly unique and scary visuals, including the shrinking TARDIS. I like that this pair of back-to-back stories from one writer serve as a Doctor showcase followed by a Clara showcase, and this story ends up being a Rosetta Stone for Clara's entire arc as a character, someone who so badly wants to be the Doctor. It's something that's been slowly bubbling under the surface of this character for a while, and bringing it to the fore like this is incredibly compelling. Not really a ton to say about this one beyond that, it's just a really good standalone episode. In the Forest of the Night is a solid episode kicked down to meh by virtue of having a resolution that I don't find at all satisfying and some subtext that rubs me wrong. The idea of a forest miraculously sprouting across the entire world overnight is an intriguing mystery, and the story maintains a very deliberate fairy tale quality that I like. But the reveal of why all this is happening just removes the show's version of Earth from our own by too many layers for me to vibe with, much like Kill the Moon. I also don't typically like it when stories about neurodivergent or neurodivergent coded characters go the anti-medication route, or conflate it with some mystical plot mumbo-jumbo. That aspect actually bugs me a lot, and the story didn't need it. As has been the case for most of this series, what's most engaging about this one is the Doctor and Clara dynamic, and specifically the ways that Clara's own Doctor-like attitude bump up against Danny's grounded and responsible perspective. It's interesting character work, and I like the pace and tone of this one, but those 2 issues I mentioned are big ones, which hold it back and make it an awkward sit. Possibly hot take, I would have made this story a single hour-long episode. Darkwater starts off on an exceptionally strong note. It's a culmination not just for the 12th Doctor and Clara's tumultuous dynamic and the Heaven story arc, but also Stephen Moffat's fascination with death as a concept. It hits the ground running with incredible intensity, giving way to exceptionally dark and morbid mystery that ramps up to a devastating cliffhanger. Death in Heaven is thematically and emotionally solid enough to serve as a mostly satisfying conclusion, but it makes a lot of choices that I don't like, and tips just over into too dark and morbid to be enjoyable. Michelle Gomez hams up big time, and moment to moment I can't decide if I like it or most of her dialogue. I do love that this ends up being a story about the Master trying in their own twisted way to do the Doctor a solid and prove their friendship. That's a great idea. It's also an interesting use of the Cybermen, certainly the most that any story has had to say with them since Series 2. But again, choices are made that I bump up against, especially near the end. On a related note, I'd significantly rework Unit's role in this story, if not just cut them out. I never love it when Moffat goes full-on wacky, cartoony comedy, and Last Christmas is full of that. His classically British absurdism is all fun, don't get me wrong, and I love Shona, she's great. But Santa and the Elves are obnoxious, I just don't think any of those punchlines land. This is a story real heavy on people standing around in rooms talking, which I've described as an appealing prospect before, but this episode just drags. This is a Moffat script brimming with clever for clever's sake exposition and plot twists, which I've made no bones about disliking in the past. This one's just extremely middle of the road. Not particularly funny or exciting or scary or emotional outside of token moments. I don't know, just feels like a lot of wheel spinning to get to twists and emotional beats that don't do a ton for me. It's the most whatever of all the Christmas specials, which is saying a lot because most of my reviews for those haven't been raves. Series 8 is Oh man, it's a lot. It feels like Moffat had the idea to take the now standard post-regeneration identity crisis that every Doctor goes through and make it an entire series-long arc. It's another series that's incredibly compelling when taken holistically as a character journey shared between the Doctor, Clara, and Danny. Unsurprisingly, this is also where Clara goes from a fairly nondescript companion to one of my favorites. It's actually super reminiscent of Series 6, in the sense that this is also a series that works much better as a holistic story than it does as a run of individual episodes. Most of the episodes here are good enough, nice for a sit down. Almost all of them sit on the knife's edge of working or not working for me, with many just barely tipping over into the latter camp. Of the whole bunch, I'd only list Mummy, Flatline, and Listen as among the greats. Check out the related video for a compilation of my Matt Smith era reviews, and like and subscribe for more videos like this one. I wonder if maybe Stephen Moffat forgot how to write two-parters after years of not doing any, because The Magician's Apprentice and The Witch's Familiar are much like Dark Water and Death in Heaven, and that they likely could have told the same story just as effectively over one longish episode on top of also just being weird. Apprentice especially is full of a lot of dumb time wasting. The parts of this story that are just Peter Capaldi and Julian Bleach acting off each other elevate this one, while Moffat continues to make extremely weird choices with the Daleks that drag it back down. Okay, the fact that the Doctor and Davros are playing each other the whole story also seriously undercuts things, I'll admit. Pairing Clara and Missy for the B-plot is an absolutely bonkers choice, and not in a totally good way. Michelle Gomez and Jenna Coleman have a natural chemistry, but once you look past that, the nature of their character dynamic doesn't actually track at all given where they were just one story prior. The performances, atmosphere, and pathos-heavy dialogue make this one a worthwhile watch, but it's one that holds up much less than I remember. Under the Lake and Before the Flood, like so many of the real solid standalone Doctor Who stories, tosses the Doctor into a tense, conceptually bonkers sci-fi mystery, and just lets us watch as he works out the puzzles. It starts fairly low stakes and clinical, but by part 2 we're doing some real good character work, and seeing for the first time in a while a Doctor who's staunch about maintaining the sanctity of time. We see it conflict with his morality, and it's a really engaging layer to add on top of the existing mystery. This is also another story that showcases what's great about Clara's character. Her controlling nature, how she's shaping up to be her own sort of clone of the Doctor, and just how uncomfortable that makes the dynamic on board the TARDIS. The supporting cast are all played by pretty charming performers, but O'Donnell especially is super cute. Rounding it all out is the Fisher King, an intimidating and visually impressive villain if ever there were one. The Doctor explaining the bootstrap paradox to the audience is also an incredibly charming and fun cold open, one of my favorites. The whole selling point of Series 9 was having almost exclusively multi-part stories, but thanks to very different plot setups and supporting casts and even writers between The Girl Who Died and its follow-up, I think it makes sense to view these separately. That said, if you told me after Series 8 that I was going to get a Moffat-Mathieson collab, I would never have expected it to be this meh. This feels like one where the tonal balance is just off. Like the goof and pathos undermine each other rather than complement. I don't know, I think the whole idea here was meant to be this swerve into tragedy coming off a deliberately silly low-stakes romp, like that's supposed to be the thing that clicks it together, but if that narrative move doesn't work, then it doesn't click. It's not funny enough to be memorable as a comedy romp, but it's too goofy and broad for the drama to feel totally at home. The Doctor gets some good monologues and exchanges with Clara, but that aside, the dialogue is kinda thin, the supporting cast is very thin, there's just not much meat on the bones here. Yep, definitely glad I decided to keep The Woman Who Lived and its predecessor separate. This one handles the balance of drama and comedy way better than its predecessor, I think. That's helped by the fact that the jokes actually make me laugh, and it makes for a very, very, very unique feeling episode. When it's not making with the yucks, it's a very tempered, moody, dialogue-based character drama, and I really love it. There's a degree to which this or any show tackling the idea of immortality and the value of life and death is trite and cliche, but it's so interesting in how it's executed here. The Doctor and Ashildr/Me have a fascinating relationship, to the point where, for as great as she is, I'm really happy Clara's not here to distract from that dynamic. Plus, they get to express that dynamic with really good dialogue. It's maybe the prime example of an episode where you just pair the Doctor with another talented actor and watch the screen crackle with their back and forth. There's an almost stage play vibe to the tone and pacing of this one, heck, even in the directing. This is a real highlight of the series, despite almost never getting talked about. The Zygon invasion/inversion is so defined by its iconic climactic speech that it's easy to forget about the entire 2 episodes of TV leading up to it. Unfortunately, there's a pretty clean break in quality between those episodes. Invasion is quite weak, while Inversion is actually pretty compelling. The former has little meat for the cast to chew on, as well as at least one scene with some of the most contrived writing and stilted performances I've ever seen from this show. It's an episode where the pacing aims for deliberate but instead ends up on dragging. It has a similar problem to Marvel's Secret Invasion, Invasion, where they try to play the paranoia around shapeshifters, but it falls a bit flat because any savvy viewer is bound to have a 100% success rate at guessing who's a shapeshifter and when. Then comes Inversion, which gets a bit more politically and thematically pointed, actually gives our main players some decent character work, lets Jenna Coleman have a great time playing a villain, and yes, is elevated by that big speech. It all averages out into a story that's just solid enough. For a long time, Sleep No More was my least favorite episode of this show ever on account of finding it terminally boring. I don't think it holds that position anymore, but it's not very good at all. It's just remarkably languid and uncompelling, kind of a tough sit even with Capaldi doing his best to carry. The story has an absolutely killer ending on paper, but in practice it's super ironic given how plain unexciting the story is beforehand. Its biggest weakness is the stylistic gimmick of having the whole episode depicted through found footage. It's a cute idea at a glance, but locking the camera to character POVs and nixing any Murray Gold score outside of atmospheric droning massively limits the potential of music and visuals to elevate the script, and offer the story a stronger sense of tone. Some more flash and pomp plus tweaking the framing device may have also served to compensate for some very iffy writing choices in regard to the big twists. Also, I appreciate how this one uses the Morpheus machine as such a strong indictment of capitalism, but monsters made of sleep crusts that also work as cameras is another one of those ideas that's just too silly for me. Completely forgot Letitia Wright was in this one. Face the Raven is in a tough spot. Like Utopia, it's technically part 1 of 3, but in such a way that it really has to be taken on its own terms, since none of the setting, plot elements, or characters really carry on to the next episodes. Unlike Utopia, though, I don't think it's particularly interesting outside of the context of what happens after it. This episode exists purely to give Clara a fitting quote-unquote death as a lead-in to the season finale, and outside of that function there's just not much to hold on to in it. If I didn't know any better, I'd say it only exists in the way it does to fill an episode count. Bringing back Rigsy, bringing back me, establishing this hidden sector of London filled with aliens and a ticking clock murder mystery could be really fun, or at least cool to think about thematically, but the story doesn't really seem like it's interested in servicing any of those things, just using them as flavor text while it sets Clara up for a fall. Both now and when it released, I finished this episode feeling like I watched an entire 45 minutes that only existed to get a plot point across. Heaven Sent is my favorite Doctor Who story. I'm not good at picking favorites, I'm kinda fickle, but this one has gotta be it. It's a one-hander with Capaldi as the only actor in all but 2 scenes. A story that pushes the Doctor to physical, mental, and emotional extremes in a way hardly any other story has. He's torn for most of this story between terror, despair, and his natural scientist curiosity and efficacy, and Capaldi plays the balance to perfection. This is one of those stories with zero time for shenanigans. The Doctor spends the entire runtime on the back foot, thinking, planning, testing, reflecting, and underneath it all, grieving. We cut deeper and deeper to that grief and the Doctor's indomitable spirit in spite of it as the episode builds deliberately to probably the best climax the show's ever had. Maybe one of the most cathartic bits of visual storytelling I can recall in anything, and it all comes together in a holistic experience that absolutely sings. Plus, it's another story where Murray Gold's scoring and Rachel Talali's direction go insanely hard and elevate the whole thing. Hellbent is exceptionally unique for a Doctor Who finale. Of all of them, it's by far the least driven by action and plot. This is a start-to-finish dialogue-driven character study. Plus, there's the whole only episode of the modern series set on Gallifrey thing, but revisiting the Doctor's home planet for the first time in decades is wisely just the flavoring on top of an emotional treatise on the Doctor-Clara relationship. These two push each other to be their worst and their best, and this episode really ties together their entire journey into a tragedy of 2 people who are just too similar to be fully healthy for each other or the universe around them. It's a bittersweet ending that's about the value of bittersweet endings. Husbands of River Song is another Moffat Christmas special that goes a bit too overboard on his specific brand of over-the-top comedy. It's like 80% shtick and banter and zany music stings, and it doesn't do it for me. It's a shame because when it leans into the drama and analyzing River Song's perspective on her and the Doctor's relationship, that stuff all works a treat, including a totally killer ending that elevates the whole thing. Capaldi and Kingston are great as always, and if nothing else, the story moves at a nice pace and features some creative if underutilized ideas. If Moffat going camp in the comedy arena does it for you, then you'll really love this one. So I lied way back when I said that Series 3 would be the only one whose wrap-up video took into account multiple Christmas specials. I forgot about the return of Dr. Mysterio, which largely has to do with it being a mostly just alright episode. It's a shame because on paper this is a killer story premise. The Doctor encounters a young comic book fan who grows up to be his universe's own actual Superman, complete with his own star-crossed Lois Lane. With all the overt 1978 Superman homages, this is basically just like dropping the Doctor into that movie. The dynamic that the Doctor and Grant have is interesting. The Doctor's always been kind of a superhero, and now there's a very archetypal superhero to mirror him on the level of neglecting his emotional needs. Justin Chatwin also does a good job writing the line between sincere send-up and hammy parody. That said, the latter half of the episode keeps Chatwin and Capaldi apart and is less engaging for it. It's a clever villain plot that's very Golden Age comic book, but the villains themselves aren't super interesting. It's just kind of a charming and unremarkable fluff. I've always held Series 9 in pretty high esteem, despite not having actually watched any of it in years prior to this project. I think its quality as a run of episodes holds up to my memory on average, however, looking on it holistically, I feel like this one's gone down a bit in my estimation, and is now resting about even with Series 8. Heaven Sent, absolute masterpiece that it is, does a lot to elevate it, but beyond that, Hellbent, The Flood two-parter, and The Woman Who Lived are all utter gems. Sleep No More is a drag, Magician's Apprentice and Face the Raven feel like padding, and the rest are all firmly okay with one or two great elements in them. More than Series 8, it actually reminds me a ton of Series 2 in that sense, as well as the sense that the Doctor and Companion's emotional journey really carries the whole vibe here. The pilot is a very apt title for another great jump-in episode for newcomers. Bill is a great eyes-in for anyone unfamiliar with the Doctor's whole deal, and it makes a great first impression as a very pragmatic, curious, sometimes silly, but also very melancholy companion. She and 12 are given the space to develop a warm and caring dynamic before she even steps foot in the TARDIS, which immediately makes their relationship unique. The idea of the Doctor as this enigmatic, gung-ho university professor is also just perfect, and adds to that teacher-student rapport that he and Bill have. Bill and Heather's story here is a tragic one, and it makes Bill's first adventure deeply personal, with her own emotions at the center. This one is a gold standard for series openers if ever there were one. Smile is another case of really cool, well-thought-out world building. Some really neat, natural-feeling sci-fi concepts here. Appropriate for a narrative about the necessary balance of sadness and happiness, this is another one of those stories of human folly that goes in a tragic direction without being cynical, a story of death punctuated by new life. The side characters are all paper-thin, but they're not even remotely the focus here. This is a Doctor and Bill two-hander for most of the runtime, with Bill sussing out what the Doctor's role in the universe actually is. The two just get to bounce off each other and the ominous atmosphere as they unravel what's going on, and it makes for a great watch. Thin Ice is another episode that I've actually done a lengthier video on, and unlike Vincent and the Doctor, that one isn't regularly thrown in copyright jail, so go check that out. The Doctor and Bill are on top form here. Sarah Dollard delivers a story that's killer, both as a standalone narrative, but also as an effective capper to this opening trilogy of episodes. Between this, Smile, and the pilot, I feel like we've gotten the greatest opening trio in any series, as far as ideally capturing what's great about this show. If I sold a newcomer on these three stories, I think they'd quickly comprehend why it's my favorite series of all time. Like and subscribe for more like this, and click on the related video for a compilation of my reviews of the Matt Smith era. Knock Knock doesn't really do anything for me. It's effectively moody, some of the visuals are actually quite scary, but the pace is sluggish and Bill's supporting cast of buddies are exceptionally unremarkable. Neither Bill nor the Doctor get any meaty character work to compensate, and the villains aren't very strong or memorable either. There's just nothing here, nothing to sink my teeth into. The tragic twist at the climax feels like it might really land in a vacuum, but as part of the story that it's in, I just don't think it brings things together smoothly. The story as a complete package just feels so light and meaningless, like it's just here so we can meet the episode count. God, Oxygen is so freaking cool. It's incredibly effective, with direction and sound design that really sell the horror of space. Even more than that though, this episode goes harder than you can imagine on the horrors of capitalism. We're already living in a world where corporations place profits over human lives in just the 21st century, so an episode where the threat is just a company actively killing its workers to save a few bucks by hoarding the very means of life feels terribly, scarably tangible and real. This is the first story where Nardole really comes into his own, and the dynamic of him, the Doctor, and Bill as a trio makes for a really good team. There's always something happening to ratchet the tension here and make this episode truly stressful. The Doctor going blind is a brave story turn, and Bill being exposed to space with no helmet is a genuinely heart-pounding sequence. This is an episode I don't often think of as among the greats, but it really fires on all cylinders. Scary, funny, clever, and thematically striking. Extremis is the one Series 10 story that I remember really liking on a first watch. It's another of Moffat's many meditations on death, and it goes real dark. Like, I can't believe an episode of a family show exists where this is the central premise, kinda dark. I'm genuinely shocked there wasn't some kind of uproar about it when it released. I've always liked that the final twist is that we've basically been watching the Doctor watch a Doctor Who episode, and that this whole time the real mystery has been discovering what next week's threat is. That tragic mystery, all the drama and tension, ends up just being about how the characters of this episode inside an episode become self-aware, and I find that fascinating. Even without the dark approach to the subject matter, it's a very fretful tone the story takes. The kind of story with an emotional climax that's just Peter Capaldi and Pearl Mackie sitting down and having a hard conversation. They both play it great, as does Matt Lucas. My only real complaint is that the Missy stuff doesn't flow super well into the main plot structurally. It feels kinda tacked on. The Pyramid at the End of the World is an immediate sequel to Extremis, and it plays with a lot of the same mystery tropes, but now with a spin of dramatic irony. Invading aliens promise to save the world from an oncoming catastrophe in exchange for ownership of the planet, and while the Doctor tries every means of discovering what the world needs saving from so the deal doesn't go through, the audience is shown from jump the escalating series of tiny accidents that spell doom. It's an episode all about the small stuff that the Doctor can't account for, on top of his hubris and insecurity in having kept his blindness a secret for so long. It's one of those stories that could have maybe used another pass or two to iron out some arbitrary feeling choices, but it sets up a neat idea and plays it out effectively with a truly killer cliffhanger. The Lie of the Land is the last story to date by Toby Whithouse, and unfortunately it's closer to a town called Mercy than the God Complex or Lake Flood two-parter on the quality scale. It's got more going for it than Mercy did. The scenes of Missy absolutely cook, and the Doctor and Bill's argument is a tour de force from Capaldi and Mackie, but I think that second one happens way too early in the episode. Bill definitely should have been made to go through a bit more on her own before the Doctor or even Nardole properly re-entered the story. That might have also helped with the big problem that is the monks ironically having next to no story presence in this episode about their ever-presence. After 2 episodes of build-up, they end up just being nothing as villains. The device of Bill talking to her imaginary mom makes logistical sense in the episode, but it feels like a forced means of reminding the audience of that dynamic so the climax feels earned, and I don't think it works in part because that climax just doesn't land. It's silly and vague instead of heartwarming or cathartic, and drags the whole story further down around it. I'll give the Empress of Mars credit for being a very blunt condemnation of British imperialism, and I didn't dislike it nearly as much on this viewing as I have in the past. There's an idea here about the pure self-serving stupidity that an empire or catch love or the Ice Queen must have to presume superiority or ownership of others. It's an interesting premise, but like so many Mark Gatiss stories, it doesn't really have greatly fleshed out characters, the dialogue is largely trite, and the pacing is all over the place. It's one of those stories where it doesn't feel like anything of note actually happens until about halfway through, but when significant events do take place, it's like the story blitzes through them. The plot here is also super tropey, with one particular story beat 3/4 in nearly making my eyes roll out of my skull. There's 1 or 2 scenes that compel, and the performances are solid, but the kindest thing I can say about it is that it's gone up in my estimation from a story I used to hate to one I now just find generically mediocre and unremarkable. The Eaters of Light is a real weird one. The dialogue is fairly decent, the themes are strong, Capaldi's great in it, and I like the Light Eaters as an uncomplicated alien threat on which to hang a mood piece like this. On top of that, I love the ending with Missy. Unfortunately, despite all those strengths, every time I rewatch this one over the years, the inescapable pest in the pie is that it's just not very engaging. It's boring, and I think the biggest reason for that is the supporting cast not leaving much of an impression. Our main trio is solid here, but this isn't really the kind of story that dynamic can carry by itself. Eaters of Light is begging for a memorable, endearing ensemble to be at the center of its ideas, but what it has instead feels like just a bunch of living mouthpieces. I don't know, I just don't think characters this thin pair well with a plot and tone this unexciting and sluggish. I'm honestly fine with the small, slow, moody folktale of a story, but the characterization has to compensate. World Enough and Time and The Doctor Falls come together to make far and away the best Cyberman story in the modern series. And if that weren't enough, it manages to be by far the best Master story in the modern series while it's at it. After so many years of both Davies and Moffat eras barely seeming to know what to do with the Cybermen, this one gives them a horrifying origin story with Bill right at the center. Pearl Mackie's been great all series, but this is her real star-making turn. Capaldi and Gomez are on absolute top form, and John Sim returns to do justice to Master in a way I feel he never got to under Davies. It's really impressive that this late into the show's history we can get a story for 2 of our 3 most recurring baddies that feels so definitive. It cuts to the bone of why these villains work against the Doctor, against the show's ideals, and in doing so it's a wonderful Doctor character piece as well. Like Hellbent before it, it's a series finale that breaks the trend of big bombastic action and stakes, and is instead driven entirely by character and performance. A top-tier S-rank finale for sure. I am being so honest when I say I don't know why Twice Upon a Time exists in the form it does. Obviously it's to fill a Christmas time slot, but The Doctor Falls would have been such a perfect goodbye to Bill, the 12th Doctor, and Stephen Moffat, and TUAT just doesn't have anything up its sleeve that justifies undercutting that. The biggest issue is how wholly it relies on that cheeky trick Moffat loves where characters never answer questions, never come out and say who, what, or why in plain terms. Also, it can be a clever reveal later, and while usually I love recontextualization, the way it's done here just feels cheap. Why is this a multi-Doctor story at all? What's Testimony's deal? Why bring back Bill right after she left? Why is the Doctor refusing to regenerate? Why does the story take a detour in Act 2? All have very simple answers, and if Moffat wasn't so keen on playing keep away with the audience, they'd maybe make for a sweet, effective 5-minute short instead of a meandering hour-long goose chase that happens to have a kinda sweet ending. It's one of Moffat's worst habits as a writer, back with a vengeance. The direction's good though. Series 10 is so close to being legit peak. At its best, its highs are even higher than Series 5. Unfortunately, while 2/3 of this run of episodes are all absolutely brilliant, compelling sci-fi, that remaining chunk is composed of subpar slogs. It really does not help that The Lie of the Land, Empress of Mars, and Eaters of Light are the most frustrating ones in the pack, and all stacked right on top of each other. That's a really bad streak. It's a shame because the great stories make it more than a worthwhile watch, and even in the weak ones, 12, Bill, and Nardole are an absolutely banger TARDIS team. 12 and Missy both feel like their dynamic and individual characters have reached their apex, to the point that within the confines of Series 10, Capaldi becomes my favorite Doctor. That I like this season as much as I do anyway tells you how great the great ones are, cause I can't think of another series besides 7 that's so backloaded with meh. It's just never not frustrating when a few bad apples makes it so the whole series can sniff gold but never taste it. The Woman Who Fell to Earth is one I always remember liking, but having barely seen it more than once since it aired, I genuinely forgot how much I enjoy it. Particularly the characterizations and Jodie Whittaker's performance really do it for me. The approach is very low-key and grounded compared to any of the Davies or Moffat premieres, but Doctor No. 13 is still a great big ball of energy. Whittaker captures the character instantly and has a very unique charm, which in the right moments really makes Chris Chibnall's material sing. Ryan, Graham, and Yaz all actually get really great character introductions. Especially in hindsight, I can tell a lot about who these people are and what they want within moments of meeting them. I think the cast has a fun chemistry, or at least the foundations for one. It's got a surprising amount of big laughs, the tragedy in the third act works. Putting aside that Tim Shaw's a kinda weak villain, I really like this story. Check out my channel for more videos reviewing the show up to this point, and subscribe for more like this. The Ghost Monument is surprisingly slow for an episode that's all about the final leg of a space race. Given the premise of our new TARDIS team falling into a competition between heated rivals on a planet of death and despair, you'd expect a lot more action and tension, and a lot less walking and talking. There is some action here, but this setup is begging to be a roller coaster and it just isn't done justice. Beyond that, it's a much more awkward, much less compelling and endearing sit than the previous story. There's some good, sweet, smaller character moments and some scenes that work broadly on paper, but are held back by some stupid choices. Jodie is still on top form, and it's mostly her carrying the whole thing. As a whole, though, it's really just kind of a slog, with the easy highlights being the reveal of the new intro and new TARDIS interior, both of which I really like. Rosa is a truly unique animal. I like how unsafe this episode feels for our team. Something standard or formula, like a moment of exposition or planning the next course of action, is always in danger at the hands of plain old mundane human cruelty around every corner. Call it forced or heavy-handed, but I like having a story where our characters can speak so frankly to how a real-world political issue impacts their everyday lives. The story is all about the impact of little things, both in the sense that it's literally a butterfly effect plot, and in how it's the small human moments that make the whole thing work. Bits like Ryan and Yaz commiserating over the racism they face, or Ryan helping a wary and guarded Rosa, feel a moment of appreciation and hope. Heck, the fact that the emotional climax is just the tragedy of the Doctor and Graham having to own their privilege, the viewer having to face that what our heroes have done here is orchestrate an act of bigotry. It's all really effective and not something you're gonna get from another story. Arachnids in the UK is the unfortunate type of episode that's exactly middle of the road. Enough good and bad in it to almost completely cancel each other out. On the one hand, it's got some solid laughs and some sweet character moments. On the other hand, it exemplifies Chibnall's capacity for very weak, very simplistic dialogue writing. It has an extremely muddled and ineffective moral debate in the third act, and while I get that it's just putting the viewer in Graham's headspace, the whole having him actually see Grace like she's a literal ghost thing is a storytelling device that I just don't vibe with. That's especially true when the episodes before and after this one handle Grace much better as a figurative specter. At the very least, the episode ends with what's easily its strongest scene, so I finish it with a smile on my face. But I'm not one of those the ending matters above all else type guys, and as a whole package, this one is okay at best. The Tsuranga Conundrum is a story that I like a lot as a collection of small moments and ideas, but I'm kinda iffy on as a complete package. I like the sense of world building, the feeling that the one-off characters and setting here have lives, or functions, or backstories outside the confines of this 45 minutes. I like that feeling Chibnall is so good at portraying, where problems just pile on, and escalate as the episode goes. And I really like the Pating as a threat and as a design. For this show, it's also a really good effect. On paper, everything about this one works, minus one or two dodgy acting moments and some dialogue that feels a bit shoehorned in. The big thing it's missing is a sense of urgency. Even as the conflicts and ticking clocks pile up, there's just something in the production that doesn't communicate the tension the way it does in something like 42. The score, the direction, the editing, the blocking, none of it is bad, but it doesn't do anything to elevate what's on the page, doesn't do anything to make this exciting. It's why I always defend this one, but seldom rewatch it. It's a story that I've already spoken about at length in a pre-existing video time again. Demons of the Punjab not only sheds light on an underrepresented historical tragedy in a relevant, meaningful way, it also uses it as a base for a great emotional time travel story about love, death, bigotry, and love reborn. In the best way possible, it feels like our leads are forced to observe a period drama about a family tragically breaking alongside a country. Team TARDIS all give great performances, even Tossin Cole, despite his lack of material to work with being Demon's one glaring flaw. The most impressive bits of acting come from the one-offs, though. Shane Zaza is iffy in some spots, but in others he cuts right to the bone with just an expression. Hamza Tatua is the story's MVP, brimming with both vulnerability and contempt. And you know, I'm gonna do something I never do, which is shout out the VA performances for the fully costumed alien characters. Emma Fielding and Isabel Middleton give the Thajarians so much reverent emotion, it really grounds the sci-fi part of the story. I could go on, this one is a modern classic. Kerblam is great. I just needed to rip that band-aid off or else I'd spend the whole short hemming and hawing about how this story's themes and messages have been received by the more politically staunch members of the fanbase. The way it's been characterized all this time, you'd think it was some kind of pro-capitalist screed, which it really isn't. What it is a story with some flawed or overly simplistic but still very, very interesting things to say about the workforce, about radicalism, and about the nature and potential of automation both in and outside of it. Seriously, I could write a whole essay about the role of AI in this episode and how it fascinates me, especially with that being a more hot-button issue in the years since. But beyond that, Kerblam is just a really solid adventure. Team TARDIS feels like they finally hit a stride with their group chemistry, and all of them are utilized well, as are all the one-offs. I especially love Jodie, she's so cool. The mystery is well structured and thought out, it's exciting, it's the most the show has made me laugh in a while. It's got those sweet character moments again, sorry guys, but I love this one. The Witchfinders is unworthy of its incredibly entertaining Alan Cumming performance. Cumming and Whittaker, and also the direction, are all trying their hardest to elevate this material, but it's blander than Wonder Bread. To begin with, I'm not really a fan of stuff that's just people walking and standing and talking in grey rooms or grey forests, and that's all of this episode. It's actually an interesting contrast to Kerblam, because while that was a cleverly constructed, engaging mystery, where all the companions were utilized well, Witchfinders is a story where one companion could have done the work of three, and where the mystery is just the Doctor standing in front of the villain and yelling, "What's going on?" for 20 minutes until an exposition dump happens. The side characters aren't engaging, the dialogue is boring, the actual plot of what's going on is super thin, and the resolution is perfunctory. I expect to forget this episode exists after posting this video, easily the weakest of the season so far. It Takes You Away is an easy highlight of the series, as good as Demons of the Punjab, if not slightly better. It takes some fascinating, esoteric sci-fi concepts and builds a very simple but emotionally powerful story around them. A story about the way isolation can drive us to do very dumb and hurtful things, and how what we all need to be better is people in our lives who will shoot straight, who won't sugarcoat harsh truths just to make us feel like things are the way we want. It's a theme that makes for a great character arc for Ryan, but also for one-off characters Hannah, Eric, and even the Soul Attract. It's subtle if you're not paying attention to it, but if you are, it's super effective. It's a pivotal moment for Ryan's growth and his relationship with Graham, which is impressive given they spend most of the story apart. That said, it's Jodie Whittaker who swoops in and steals the episode in its climax. She goes from largely a source of exposition and laughs to the astoundingly sincere beating heart of the narrative. Her performance carries what should be a ridiculous rushed moment into something truly powerful. If this one's not an all-time great, it's pretty freaking close. I've used first draft as shorthand for an especially poor story throughout these reviews, but the Battle of Rangskor Avkalos is the first one that I'm aware of for which that's literally true. It's got one thing in common with the last story, I guess, and that the thing that stuck out to me most is the Ryan character work. But while that was just one of a great many engaging and interesting elements in It Takes You Away, in Rangskor it's the single saving grace that can't actually save anything. The scenes of half-decent character drama between Ryan and Graham are barely 1/3 of a story that is otherwise completely, utterly mired in exposition and plot and technobabble. All the areas where Chibnall's writing is the clunkiest. The Doctor, Yaz, Tim Shaw, and all the one-off characters are given nothing to work with, despite Jodie Whittaker and Samuel Oakley trying their hardest to elevate the material. It's a dull, gray slog that could barely hold my attention for a full scene. Broken down, I guess there's more to like here than in Witchfinders, but this is only one of 2 episodes in this show to literally put me to sleep, and it honestly makes me a bit angry. Resolution is, fittingly enough, the true resolution to Series 11. More than any other special, this feels like an actual finale, and not just because a Dalek story is basically a rite of passage for any TARDIS team. We bring Ryan's arc, really the big underlying story of the season, full circle. His dad Aaron and the conflict there is written with shocking subtlety and economy by Chibnall standards, and it paves the way for Tossin Cole and Daniel Adeboyega to give truly affecting performances. I'm also very impressed with Charlotte Ritchie as the Daleks' human hostage. For all we've seen them wreak havoc on a wide scale, there's something novel about spending so much of this story on a Dalek tormenting and puppeteering just one regular terrified woman as it slowly reconstructs itself and leaves behind a trail of bodies. As a Dalek story, it's utterly unique, but it's also the first time in a long while that I think one of these captures the Doctor-Dalek dynamic the way I like it most. Chibnall and Whittaker take the chance to bring out the Doctor's pointed, loathing, competitive side. It's really fun. This is the first Chibnall script that I feel truly fires on all cylinders. Top tier for modern Dalek stories. I always forget Series 11 is 3 or 4 episodes shorter than any prior run of stories. I consider it a step down from Series 10, but only a slight one. Right now, I'd say it's most akin to Series 1, 2, 6, or 8, which I guess fittingly are mostly also seasons introducing new Doctors. Separated from the noxious online discourse, Series 11 was overall a really fun rewatch, though dragged down by the occasional clunker. A couple of stories were a real snooze, but even in the worst stories, I tended to find positives to latch onto, namely the overarching character stuff. Yaz kinda gets the shaft, but I left these stories with a way deeper appreciation for Ryan, Graham, and Dr. 13 than I've ever had before. Witchfinders and Rangskor are the only ones I'd call trash that I have no desire to ever watch again. But by contrast, Rosa and the series premiere were both quite strong, and if It Takes You Away, Punjab, Kerblam, and Resolution aren't outright classics, then they certainly come close. Ultimately, I'm happy with this revisit, and I feel this series deserves to be looked on more fondly. Spyfall is far from awful, but heavily flawed. This story solidifies a bit of a pattern I've noticed in Chibnall scripts as showrunner. Fun or neat character traits and beats communicated with some of the least natural dialogue the show's yet had. But I really like what that dialogue is in service of, mostly, when it's not just characters narrating what's happening to them like an audio drama. The first half is easily the weaker of the two, with Lenny Henry utterly wasted as the plank of wood villain Barton. But then Sacha Dhawan reveals himself as the Master, and from that scene on, the story has an energy that at least carries me through to the end. All throughout, Chibnall continues to prove solid at the comedy and the warm, sweet character relationship moments, but even with Part 2 picking up, the plot here feels unfocused. The story is torn between 2 big motifs, one being the history of computer technology and the other being spycraft. Those 2 broad ideas should naturally come together, but I don't know if they really complement each other by the end of this. It feels like Chibnall really wanted to explore both motifs in tandem, but hadn't worked out a clear theme that services both. Orphan 55 is that rare story that's genuinely a chore to finish. What it reminds me most of is honestly Nightmare in Silver. The script had to have been horribly compromised somewhere in the production, because there's no other way I could picture the guy who gave us It Takes You Away writing something so confusing, meandering, and boring in that way only a complete hack job can be. The plot technically has a lot going on, arguably too much, but at the same time it feels like nothing happened in it. There's some small cute character moments scattered about, but for the most part the TARDIS crew feels like an afterthought in this bloated cast, the Doctor included. It doesn't help that you could 100% cut half or more of the characters here while losing almost nothing, and even the ones who are vital to the plot leave no impression and are treated by the story as disposable. It all builds to the Orphan 55 was Earth all along twist, which is contrived and only serves to force a message about environmentalism. It's just an utterly flaccid story, and I had mentally checked out well before it finished. Why is Nikola Tesla's Night of Terror set almost entirely in daytime? I can't speak for what the real Nikola Tesla was like, but I find the character they've created with him here really endearing and interesting. Gotta say, I still like this one, but it didn't hit for me the way it has in the past. It's solid, and I like what it has to say about the nature of genius and invention versus those who profit off it, but something's just missing to tip it over into great territory. I think the problem is it's one of those episodes that gets a bit too hung up on plot and theme and loses out on character. Again, Tesla himself is great, and he bounces well off both the Doctor and Thomas Edison, but anyone who's not Goran Vishnik doesn't get a ton of material to work with. It's not a dearth of character, everyone at least feels human and multifaceted, and that helps the themes feel nuanced. It's frustrating, but I can't fully articulate what missing ingredient stops this one from going beyond a solid B grade, a worthwhile watch, but not the modern classic I once viewed it as. Did you know I talk about Marvel and Kingdom Hearts sometimes? Click the related video to listen to me talk at length about both and how I'd cross them over. Fugitive of the Judoon holds up way better than I figured it would. However you may feel about how the threads here are paid off, I think the events of this story are a really powerful launchpad for the 13th Doctor's long-lasting identity crisis. Knowing where it all goes makes the intended emotions land really well. Seeing Captain Jack again is great, and part of me really likes what his scenes with the other companions accomplish here, but another part of me thinks that if anything would make this story stronger, it would be cutting all four of them outside of Ryan, Graham, and Yaz's scene at the very end. I appreciate that they're already separated from the Doctor for enough of the story that she feels left to weather these earth-shattering revelations on her own, but I'd also adore it if the tension of the Doctor and Ruth scenes played out over more of the episode. It would also maybe be cool if the Judoon themselves didn't feel so lost in the sauce of everything else going on, as the story approaches some really timely commentary on aggressive policing that doesn't really go anywhere. Regardless, the performances all shine in this one, Whittaker and Joe Martin especially, and it had my attention locked in, especially in the back half. I like Praxeus a lot. It's a really solid episode that I think could have been a really great one if it lent a bit heavier on the concepts and character drama and a bit lighter on the exposition. It's the second story by Kerblam writer Pete McTighe, and the two stories definitely share a vibe. They're both pretty straightforward but interesting and unique sci-fi conflicts. Both have somewhat sympathetic antagonists in disguise as benevolent supporting characters who perform inhumane experiments on people, etc. Praxeus struggles a little more than Kerblam did in giving everyone in the cast stuff to do, and like I said, the dialogue is a smidge too expository and techno-babbly, but when it does stop to focus on the drama and the ideas, it's compelling. Suki and her whole plot are super interesting, as is how the Doctor reacts to them. Frankly, I wish that were all a bigger focus. Adam is an engaging side character with a fully formed arc, and he and Jake are sweet. The TARDIS crew all get fun little moments, I could go on. Gabriella is a character the story probably could have done without, I think, but overall I think this one deserves a bit more recognition. Can You Hear Me is one of those stories that I think exemplifies the entire Chibnall era really well, and reflects my thoughts on the whole oeuvre. It's full of ideas and themes and moments that I like a lot, understated but effective bits of humor, intriguing high-concept plot, a very grounded sense of drama, pointed symbolism and metaphor, and companion characterization that feels more meaningful and revealing with the benefit of hindsight for Ryan and Yaz here especially. Unfortunately, it also reflects the era's recurring problems with rushed plot resolutions, one-off characters who are interesting on paper but not done a full service, and worst of all is the tendency of stories in this era to be just not very exciting. For someone like me, the character work and ideas can sustain a run of stories like this, but it was watching this one where it fully sunk in that the Chibnall years lacked a real kinetic energy that the RTD and Moffat terms have/had. Inject that energy into this story and also give it 5 to 10 more minutes to play out more naturally, and we'd have a really solid one on our hands. The Haunting of Villa Diodati is just soaking, dripping in pure horror atmosphere. It's maybe the most straightforward horror piece the show's ever done, all gothic and macabre, and it definitely feels like the atmosphere was the story's top priority with a bullet. The characterization and structure is all solid too, but even when this story reveals itself as part 1 of a 3-part finale, with the arrival of half Cyberman Ashad, the vibe is unrelenting. Ashad himself is such a visually, tonally dark and oppressive baddie. In a lesser episode, I feel like the mere presence of something as explicitly sci-fi as the Cybermen would threaten to take this out of the horror genre, but right up till everything resolves, the visuals, music, performances, and plot here, everything minus some sparing comic relief from Ryan and Graham, it all pours into taking this one deadly, morbidly serious. It's the story's commitment to tone and vibe that I think makes it the strongest of Series 12. Did you know I talk about Marvel and Kingdom Hearts sometimes? Click the related video to listen to me talk at length about both and how I'd cross them over. Any 2-part finale that paired the Master and Cybermen again so soon after World Enough in Time and the Doctor Falls was always doomed to pale in comparison, and Ascension of the Cybermen and the Timeless Children pales indeed. Ascension in particular is an utter snooze where it feels like almost nothing happens. The Timeless Children is actually the more watchable of the two parts. I'd even say it's a mostly good episode, mainly because of how ludicrously hard Sacha Dhawan goes. Underneath all the smiles and mayhem, his master's dripping, gushing with rage and heartbreak at his lost sense of self in every line, which almost justifies the big twist all on its own. There's other scattered ideas and character moments here that I think work, but he is really what saves the story, and it's all the Timeless Child parts of these two episodes that actually engage me. If it's a scene of Dhawan and Whittaker playing off each other, then I genuinely think it's great stuff, compelling ideas on paper elevated by great performers. Unfortunately, all the Cyberman stuff largely falls flat, and this is another bloated two-parter that could have been reworked into 1 hour-length episode. Revolution of the Daleks is a sequel to Resolution from the previous year, and while I found Resolution to be almost revelatory in how well it held up, this one is still plenty enjoyable, but also much less focused. It shares strengths with its predecessor, mainly being a great final showcase for Ryan. I've come to really love and appreciate Ryan's character over these two series, and his scenes with the Doctor here display so much character growth and got me genuinely teary-eyed in spots. In a lot of ways, Ryan was the heart of Series 11 and 12, and I'm gonna miss him and Graham. It's also a decent showcase for the Daleks, though ultimately their whole plot feels like a background to the character stuff. On that note, while John Barrowman and Chris Noth are both far from anyone's good graces, this last appearance from Jax, Harkness, and Robertson are fun. Harkness is really just here to be a friendly face that breaks some tension, and I can't help but appreciate Noth's screen presence, which feels very unique for this show. Between all these different story elements though, that lack of focus is a real issue. The episode doesn't quite have time to give a real meaty dramatic impact to anything but Ryan and Graham's departure. Series 12 has been kind of a disappointing revisit, not in the sense that I didn't enjoy myself with it or that I got nothing out of it, but it's an extremely rare occasion where I don't think there's any all-time great or noteworthy bangers in it. Villa Diodati comes close, but while the batting average here is better than, say, Series 7, it's largely a string of flawed but watchable ones, with only 1 or 2 super solid ones, and Ascension of the Cybermen and Orphan 55 as the big noteworthy L's. There's just kind of a vibe about this season, the sense that it could be a marked improvement on Series 11, that at least half the stories could be totally peak, but something just felt off. It all comes back to that problem I mentioned before of Chibnall's style being fairly unexciting. It's a series full of great ideas and great moments, stuck in stories that don't capitalize on them to make great episodes. Flux is, for all intents and purposes, a single massive Doctor Who story told over the course of a whole season, and while I don't love that choice on principle, the Halloween apocalypse is a pretty solid setup that effectively conveys a sense of scale and menace. It's not very spooky or scary, which is a shame for what's ostensibly a Halloween special, but this episode is basically Act 1 of a really long Doctor Who movie, and there's so much going on I can understand spook factor not being a priority. There's a lot being juggled, and a lot of pieces being set up on the board here, and as set up, I think it's all really interesting. The Doctor and Yaz, heck even just Yaz as an individual, finally start to form something of a dynamic here. The cadre of villains being introduced or reintroduced all pique my interest, Dan makes an endearing impression, and everything comes together to really sell the Flux itself as this unprecedented massive threat. Flux as a series is going to be a little hard to talk about in chunks, but as its own hour of television, I think this episode stands pretty strong. It's a pleasant surprise. War of the Sontarans is Flux Part 2, and it's slightly weaker than Halloween Apocalypse solely on account of what I'll call the connective tissue parts of this miniseries. The villains Swarm and Azir and the planet called Time, it's also immediately abstract and difficult to parse for me, that I just feel unmoored from the story when they're the focus. They make for another great ending cliffhanger, I'll admit, and they're definitely the C-plot of this episode, but when this one works, it's purely on the strength of the Sontaran A and B plots. This story captures an absurd tragedy to the Sontarans that the rest of the modern era never manages to, I think, and it subtly positions 13's specific attitude and quirks in a way that make her maybe the best Doctor to foil the Sontarans in method and ideology. Dan also continues to make a big impression, though his character is so borderline farcical it threatens to become odd in an off-putting way rather than endearing. I feel like I'd love this one if it were a standalone, though it's also possible future context will make me appreciate the parts I currently find less palatable. While the previous 2 episodes were very much part of one long ongoing story, Once Upon a Time is the first part of Flux I can't really treat at all like a standalone episode. It does have a backstory for the new character Vinder with a beginning, middle, and end at least, and I find that stuff all pretty cool. Vinder and his lover Belle are both likable characters. I want to see them reunited, and their journey is the narrative spine for an episode that's otherwise all about providing context for what's to come. What I'll say is that it feels like Chibnall is taking advantage of having so many episodes to tell one story. The guy loves big esoteric concepts, which usually get disserviced by being delivered in paragraphs of rushed exposition. Here, he takes a whole hour to parse out bits of answers and backstory that would normally be glossed over, and it's kept me wanting to know more about the actual plot. Whittaker does a fantastic job playing the Doctor's desperation for those answers, just continually impressing me with her performance. That said, I feel like much of this one will live and die with how well it's paid off later. Village of the Angels is a weird one. Not structurally or tonally or anything, more just in the feelings it brings out in me. I've never loved the Weeping Angels the way so much of fandom has, but I've appreciated their fear factor enough that a base under siege story, with them at the center, should carry me to satisfaction. There's a slowly unraveling mystery here, a big twist at the end that ties everything back to the arc of the miniseries, the Doctor doing doctory stuff, and a cool new supporting character in the form of Jericho, but I don't know, I just end this episode, and in spite of all that, I don't feel like I'd have missed much if I skipped it. The spooky, tense atmosphere works, but this episode isn't the mood piece. It's a very, very plot-driven puzzle designed to get the Doctor from A to B, and my only reaction when it all finished was that it could probably get the same idea across in a fraction of the time, and I'd care about as much. I like Survivors of the Flux a lot, probably my favorite episode of the miniseries. Certainly the one where I'm most enjoying all of the various subplots and never feeling as though any one storyline is a drag on the episode around it. Yaz, Dan, and Jericho having spent 3 years off-screen as archaeologist adventurers at the dawn of the 20th century is a super interesting setup, and I like their trio dynamic. The Grand Serpent undermining UNIT through the decades is an intriguing mystery with a killer reveal at the end. Recurring elements finally start to build to a head, but paramount to all of that is the scenes between the Doctor and Tecteun. For the first time in 60 years, the Doctor comes face to face with what's ostensibly their parent, and Barbara Flynn and Jodie Whittaker take full advantage of that narrative opportunity. The range of emotion between the two is captivating, the disdain, the disappointment, the cruelty, and the affection and longing buried deep beneath. It genuinely hurts a bit to watch in a good way. This is one that I had such a good time with, I want to go back and smack myself in the past for dismissing it. The Vanquishers sets out to aggressively tie up every loose end that the Flux has presented up to now. In my opinion, it manages to do so in a way that's largely satisfying. Certain dramatic beats or character exits feel rushed, and the story suffers from the previous episode's decision to take Tecteun off the board unceremoniously, but the three-pronged plot here between the Sontarans, the Ravagers, and the Grand Serpent is one that I really enjoy. My biggest complaint is that as a finale to this run of episodes, Yaz and Dan have shockingly little to do with how they've not been given a concrete stake in any of the storylines left to be resolved. But Jodie Whittaker is fantastic as always, and now there's 3 of her. I think if the previous 5 episodes succeeded in getting you invested in these characters and plots, then this one should bring them all to a satisfying close. I used to hate Flux. I used to hate Flux. I found it totally incomprehensible, boring, and called it the nadir of the show for a long time. Thankfully, we've hit one of those times where past me was just being kinda dumb, I guess. Flux is far from flawless, but I reacted so much better to it than I could have ever expected on this viewing. Cared so much more about its ideas and characters and drama. I was really taken in by the performances here, and while Chibnall's still not winning any awards for dialogue, this miniseries contained some of his best writing in my opinion. And I took the decision to make this a connected miniseries way better than on first watch. You can tell how much Chibnall loves the Sontarans, something we have in common, because this series is the best showcase they've ever gotten in the modern era, practically the definitive Sontaran story. The Doctor's desperation for answers also gives this one an energy that Series 11 and 12 lacked. Biggest issues are that the 2 middle episodes didn't quite hit for me, and Yaz is a character who's still largely disserviced outside of episode 5. But man, if you're like me and haven't watched or thought about Flux in a long time, I recommend you give it another shot. Eve of the Daleks is... it's fine. It positions itself as kind of a coda to Flux, but doesn't have anything to add to what that story was saying. As a standalone story, it's got some funny moments, a neat premise, and charming side characters, but there's very little memorable about it. The thing that stands out most is a firm negative, and that's how this is the story that makes me realize I don't really like the Doctor and Yaz dynamic. Like, at all. It's the first story to overtly confirm Yaz having romantic feelings for the Doctor, and the way it all plays out has the opposite of the intended effect, where I'm just left thinking that these two would be really bad for each other, that I've watched their relationship be utterly stagnant without any meaningful progression or deepening for the last dozen or so episodes. Romantically or platonically, this is the straw that broke the camel's back and made these two my definitive least favorite TARDIS pairing. The way this story ends really put me in kind of a poor mood, definitely the weakest of the New Year's specials. I've watched Legend of the Sea Devils twice, and I'm not gonna lie to you, I still don't actually feel like I've seen this episode. This might sound weird, I don't know, but Paying attention to this story is hard. Both now and when it aired, I found myself regularly spacing out, missing big chunks of scenes, and yet feeling like I'd missed nothing at all. The big issue here is how cripplingly plot-centric it is. 90% of the dialogue here is exposition or furthering plot points or establishing a MacGuffin or plot device, and I don't think that's exaggerating. It's all just plot, just events happening with no thematic or emotional grounding. When we get to the final moments, we actually get some decent emotional material for the Doctor and Yaz, which addresses the issues I've had with their relationship and frames it all in a pretty tragic way. That part hits, but nothing with the Sea Devils or ancient Chinese pirates that we spent 40 minutes on beforehand complements that brief slice of character work. It almost feels like Chibnall thought of that one scene and then slapped together a premise, and only a premise, to fill the runtime leading up to it. It's crazy that Power of the Doctor manages to outclass the last 3 regeneration stories by virtue of being mostly okay. In all seriousness, this one left me with a lot of complicated feelings that I had to sit on. It's kind of a big mess, and it's hurt by leaning so hard on Sacha Dhawan, who's giving a weirdly off-his-game performance that tips over into annoying rather than compelling. It's the first story to feature the Master, Daleks, and Cybermen, but the latter 2 factions have very little to do. What makes it all worth it is a very strong thematic core about the value of the companions, and the Doctor's biggest strength being their ability to make friends. The scenes of Ace and Tegan are all absolutely killer. What really muddles it, though, is how the end of the 13th Doctor frames her tenure, and especially her relationship with Yaz, as deeply sad and tragic in a way I don't know if Chibnall intended. So much of it is a big, explosive roller coaster of a story, but then it sucker punches you with this intricate, melancholy feeling about where this Doctor ended up emotionally, and I can't decide if I appreciate it or find it off-putting. Guess I gotta do one of these for the Star Beast, since it's the one I haven't gotten to yet. As the big first impression for RTD's return, this one's really limp and... it's bad. It's just plain bad, you guys. Between the resolution to the meta-crisis, the downright baffling way the Doctor doesn't seem remotely concerned for Donna's safety in the second act, and a lot of little dumb plot things in between, this one is ridiculously contrived, just reeks of first draft. It's definitely an effective sequel to The End of Time, being just as bombastic, melodramatic, and stupid as that one was. And I'm sorry, there's no nice way to say this, Yasmine Finney is not nearly a strong enough actress to shoulder as much of this story as she's asked to. She's wooden and stiff, and the fact that I'm somehow supposed to believe she's 15 doesn't help. There's a charm to it, the meep is silly in the fun way, the small bits of grounded character drama work, and Tennant and Tate imbue every line with natural charisma as always, but after several revisits, I just can't call it a good or compelling story. While Blue Yonder is such a huge step up from the Star Beast, it almost feels a little funny. It's pretty slow in the first half, though I wouldn't call it boring since it's carried by a palpable eeriness. It's with the arrival of the No-Things at the halfway point that the story takes off into a great, truly off-putting dual character study with a killer sci-fi premise. If the Star Beast felt like it was written by the same Russell T Davies who thought up The End of Time, then While Blue Yonder feels very much like the Davies who gave us Midnight and Waters of Mars, pairing creative sci-fi mystery with some shockingly nihilistic themes, real emotional mavity, and body horror like the show has never seen. For all the talk of this new era of Doctor Who potentially functioning as a reboot, it's really cathartic to see so much character work here pivot around the flux and everything else the Doctor's character has been through since Davies left the show without getting too expositional about it. Tate and Tennant are on their A-game, and giving them a two-hander like this really justifies bringing the pair back to the screen after 15 years. Overall, it's an episode for the ages, maybe one of Davies' best. Let me know in the comments what you thought of the episode, and if you like the prospect of me doing a whole series of Doctor Who reviews in this format. The giggle is if you took the phrase "have your cake and eat it too" and made it a Doctor Who episode. For all that's been made about these specials not feeling particularly anniversary, I gotta admire the sheer brass cojones on Russell T Davies, basically attempting to give the Doctor a happy ending to 60 years of televised hardship and setting the stage for the story to continue in one fell stroke. I'm genuinely excited for Ncuti Gatwa's era as a Doctor who's explicitly shed off a lot of baggage and will take the show in a fresh, hopeful new direction. But for all that the giggle manages to be both a cathartic happy ending and promising new beginning for the character, I don't think it's a very good episode of TV on its own. The concept of the Toymaker is really cool, an all-powerful being who filters the entirety of human interaction through the prism of games. But I found myself pretty uninvested in that whole conflict, and ultimately all the Toymaker stuff felt like filling time to get to the twist. It's definitely an episode I could say lots more about in a longer video that I may or may not make in the future, but on the level of sheer enjoyment of the story, it's just alright. I don't know if it's the increased budget from Disney or if RTD's stance on Doctor Who has just changed that much in 15 years, but these specials show he's willing to take the series in weird, kinda arbitrary places that he never would have done in his first tenure. A big part of me admires that and wants to see it pushed even further, but another persistent part of me feels like more stories like The Church on Ruby Road are at risk of moving away from the show that I love, and especially at risk of alienating a potential new audience, which sucks. I guess if nothing else, it's fun for me not knowing what to expect. After 2 viewings, what I can say with confidence is that Ncuti, Gatwa, and Millie Gibson are immediately captivating both apart and together, and I'm looking forward to more of their dynamic. That said, my doctor-companion romance senses are tingling again, and that idea is significantly less exciting. As for the story itself, the turning point where baby Ruby gets kidnapped in the past is really effective, but the rest of the Goblin plot unfortunately has the same problems as the Giggle, with a lot of cool, broad ideas I'd have liked to see given more focus and clarity. Overall, it's another on a pile of just pretty okay at best Christmas specials. Space Babies reminds me a lot of The Beast Below, to the point I'd say it's basically RTD remaking that episode in his own style. That's both in terms of plot, as a kind of far-fetched and silly premise set on a space station heavily featuring small children, and a similar plot turn in the climax, but also in terms of general tone and feel. Ncuti, Gatwa, and Millie Gibson cement a dynamic here that's both unique, but also super reminiscent of Matt Smith and Karen Gillan. The idea of the Space Babies themselves could seem extremely cheap at a glance, goofy for the sake of audacity and attention grabbing, but as it turns out, positioning the Doctor and Ruby as parental figures is just a really smart way to reinforce the core of their characters. Combined with the presence of a literal boogeyman, it also reinforces the show's nature as a sort of series of fables. I really like it thematically, and it's something the rest of the series promises to build on as a central idea. This one is a good time, but I don't see myself rushing to revisit it. The humor is hit and miss, and we're still very much in primer territory. Music is such a fundamental part of human existence, and by extension of Doctor Who, that it's a shock it took so long for an episode like The Devil's Chord to exist. Boy am I glad it does though, because this was a blast. Not quite an all-timer, but there's something genuinely spectacular baked into the soul of this one. Every era has that story that really cements its nature, and I think we've hit it for this one. Here we confirm the already alluded to path of this regeneration, bigger and more bombastic than the show has ever been in tone and style. That means big silliness, but also big despair and big romanticism and a big willingness to experiment with form. It's just so fresh for the show, and it suits Gatwa as a performer perfectly. It also really suits Jinx Monsoon, who is instantly iconic as the Maestro. One of those villains that's going to be remembered for a long time. Getting a follow-up on the whole Toymaker's Legion thing wasn't something I expected so quickly, but I like the desperation and fear that these absurd, non-universal beings bring out in the Doctor. I also love the way this one is directed. The cinematography doesn't always stand out in this show, but it's on point here. It's insane how immediately identifiable and distinct Stephen Moffat's writing style is. You could never mistake his characterization or dialogue writing for someone else, be that for good or ill. Thankfully, in Boom, it is absolutely for good, even if those distinct Moffatisms are a tiny bit conspicuous. The tone of this one is absolutely despairing, and one of the many ways Moffat shows off his mastery of the craft here is by having just the smallest drops of hope and levity be constantly undercut by tragedy until the final minutes. The key word that this one is absolutely brimming with is tension. The real, palpable, knee-slapping kind of tension. And with 95% of the episode set in a single crater, so much of that is down to the actors. From the instant he showed up, Ncuti Gatwa's played the Doctor like a raw nerve of pure unfiltered feeling, and when you pair that performance with Moffat's writing, it forces him into a place where every note of sadness or indignation is visceral in a way I genuinely don't think another Doctor could have pulled off. I don't know if I'd call this one of Moffat's best, but even as I'm saying that, I anticipate it being one I love even more on a second viewing. 73 Yards is deeply unsettling, and I absolutely adore it. It's an unapologetic horror folktale, once again making great use of the season's lean into the magical and fantastic to tell a story I wouldn't even begin to class as sci-fi. By now, you should know that I'm an easy mark for that stuff. I love when Doctor Who just dives headfirst into other genres, and the fact that this is an episode that leaves more questions than answers is honestly a strength in my opinion. It was such a great idea to make this the first proper Doctor Light story in years. It really lets you feel Ruby's sense of helplessness. If I had to lob a complaint here, it's that I'm not sure if I really know Ruby any better by the end of this than I did at the start, but the sheer level of empathy I'm made to feel for her discomfort, isolation, betrayal, and resignation more than compensates. As far as I'm concerned, this makes 3 bangers in a row. Dot and Bubble continues this season's hot streak, but while it's so close to being a capital G great story, it's held back by a single creative decision which, I don't know, being generous, I want to call how it's handled a mistake of being too subtle, maybe giving viewers too much credit. I typically avoid even vague spoilers when doing shorts for brand new stuff, but it needs to be said that Dot and Bubble is all one slow build to a massive reveal which completely recontextualizes its social commentary, its external conflict, the setting, and the characters, the Doctor included. It lives and dies on how much of a gut punch its ending is and how Ncuti performs in reaction to it, and it's nearly an all-time great moment that's just slightly undermined by the writing playing it a bit too coy. I felt it hard, and this is a really strong episode which I see getting better still in my estimation on a rewatch, but with just the slightest dialogue tweaks we could have avoided this feeling I have that RTD maybe got cold feet at the last second. Regardless, this makes 4 really good ones in a row. From the little I've looked, it seems like people are generally pretty high on Rogue, so it saddens me a bit to say that for me, this is where the hot streak ends. I just got nothing out of this one, and it's especially a shame that the one story written by New Blood is the one I've liked the least. Jonathan Groff and Ncuti Gatwa are both charismatic performers, but the whirlwind romance between the Doctor and Rogue moves way too fast, to the point that I can't even cite their chemistry on screen as a consistent merit. This thing needed to be 2 parts, or at least an hour, to give their dynamic time to progress naturally. You especially need that for someone like me, who's biased against the idea of the Doctor in a romantic relationship with anyone, and needs to be won over every time the show attempts to make that happen. The Doctor, Rogue, and Ruby are all actually left feeling very thin, and the villains are beyond lame. I also thought the direction was a step down from previous weeks. This is the most an episode's let me down in this new era, after going into it very excited, and I wish I could see in it what others did. Well, that was actually quite limp. Empire of Death is the worst of Davies' series finales, by a lot, and it only gets weaker and weaker for me with every passing moment. It feels to me like Davies had no clue what to do with Sutekh past the surprise of him being here at all, so rather than a big blockbuster epic, like his other finales, we get a very small feeling affair that's still saddled with convoluted, vague, or unsatisfying writing choices, only now there's no bombast to compensate. There's 1 or 2 isolated scenes that really work here, but this is another story where not much actually feels like it happens, or where the whole episode is just about making one plot point take place. Sutekh shows up, does some damage that you know is going to get reset, and then it gets reset. There's not much here that's fun, or clever, or funny. What it attempts to say about the Doctor's character feels rote and pedestrian. I don't know why Mel's here, this was just a real wet fart to end the season on. Doctor Who Series 14, or Season 1, or whatever, is, on average, pretty okay. Ncuti Gatwa and Millie Gibson have oodles of chemistry, but they're not given the space to develop as strong of a dynamic as written that most other TARDIS teams have. By the end of this, I honestly feel like I'm less invested in the 15th Doctor, and like I understand his character less well than I did in the early stories. Counting the Christmas special, this run is 5 largely disposable and mediocre bits of fluff, including the finale, interrupted by a string of 4 consecutive all-time greats. 73 Yards, Boom, The Devil's Cord, and Dot and Bubble are all going to go down as timeless classics in my personal estimation, while all the rest I probably wouldn't miss if I never saw again. Unfortunately, I think it's definitely the weakest full season that Davies has done. In a lot of ways, it's for him what Series 7 was for Moffat, though it's still better than that. Next season needs to either bring in new writers or lean way away from serialization, cause another overarching storyline this unsatisfying would kill me.
Gentlemen, I've got news for you.
You can't just take what I look like without consulting me!
Just a minute. You say we've gone back in time?
Yes, quite so.
Why do I always let my curiosity get the better of me?
Oh, well, having reached that brilliant conclusion, how about getting on with it?